The soldier was dying on the table when he opened his eyes and saw her. Not the surgeon barking orders. Not the charge nurse shoving people out of the way. Her. Standing in the corner in plain blue scrubs, holding a clipboard like she didn't belong anywhere near this room. His cracked lips moved. The monitor screamed, blood soaked through 3 layers of dressing. And in the middle of all that noise, with maybe 90 seconds left before his heart gave out entirely, Commander Dale Merritt whispered 4 words that stopped Claire Donovan cold. "It can't be you." Nobody in that trauma bay understood what he meant. They were about to find out. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we drop stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Smash the like button if Claire's already got you, and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the night everything changed. The last ambulance of Claire Donovan's shift arrived at 11:47 p.m., and she almost didn't see it pull in. She was at the nurse's station, finishing a discharge note on a 42-year-old with a hypertensive crisis who had spent the better part of 4 hours insisting he didn't need to be there. The ER at Lakemont General Hospital was the kind of place that never fully quieted. Not at midnight, not at 3 in the morning, not on Christmas. Ashford, Montana had a way of keeping its emergency room honest. Logging accidents, farm equipment, the occasional bar fight that escalated past anyone's expectations. Tonight had already delivered a compound tibial fracture, 2 cases of alcohol poisoning, and a teenager who had dislocated his shoulder attempting something he'd seen on social media. Claire had been working trauma for 6 years at Lakemont. She knew the rhythms, she knew the sounds. So when the ambulance bay doors slammed open with that particular velocity, that deliberate, controlled urgency that separated the serious runs from the routine ones, she looked up. The paramedics were moving fast. Not panic fast. Trained fast. There was a difference, and Claire had learned to read it before most people even registered the noise. "GSW, upper chest, left side," the lead paramedic called out, her voice clipped and efficient. Tension developing. BP's tanking. 60 over palp. He was conscious on scene, lost it in the rig. The trauma team converged. Claire stepped away from the station and moved toward Bay 3, the largest of the trauma rooms. Muscle memory more than conscious decision. She was intercepted before she made it 6 feet. "Donovan." Marissa Holt didn't raise her voice. She never did. She didn't have to. The charge nurse at Lakemont General had a way of deploying silence like a weapon. A slight pause, a tightening around the eyes, a particular arrangement of her posture that communicated exactly how little she thought of whoever was standing in front of her. Marissa was 47, sharp-featured, and had held her position for 11 years. In that time, she had developed opinions about which nurses belonged in trauma and which ones belonged elsewhere, and she had made her opinion of Claire Donovan clear from approximately the 3rd week of Claire's employment. "Bay 3 is covered," Marissa said. "Dr. Pallister's running it. You've got bed 7. "Bed 7 is a sprained wrist," Claire said. "Then it'll be quick." The paramedic said, "Tension's developing." I heard what the paramedic said. Marissa's voice dropped a notch, which paradoxically made it harder to argue with. "Dr. Pallister is board certified in emergency medicine. He has this. You have bed 7. Go." Claire held the eye contact for 1 beat longer than was comfortable, then turned toward bed 7. The patient there was a retired schoolteacher named Gerald, who had tripped on his front step and caught himself badly. He was apologetic about the inconvenience, embarrassed to be there, and kept insisting his wrist was probably fine. Claire wrapped it with more gentleness than she felt, and ordered the x-ray and kept one ear trained on Bay 3, where she could hear Dr. Pallister's voice rising and falling in that particular cadence of someone managing a situation they were confident about. She told herself it was fine. She had learned over the years at Lakemont to tell herself a lot of things were fine. The name on the intake form was Dale Merritt. That meant nothing to her yet, just another name in a night full of names. She heard it when the paramedic gave the handoff, and it went into the background noise with everything else. What she noticed, because she was standing 12 feet away at Gerald's bedside and the trauma bay curtain was partially open, was the chest, the asymmetry of it, the left side not moving quite the way the right side was. The position of the trachea, just slightly, just barely, off-center. She'd seen it twice before in her life. Once in a hospital, once somewhere else, somewhere she didn't discuss at Lakemont, somewhere that felt like it belonged to a different version of herself entirely. She set down Gerald's chart. "Be right back," she told him. She walked to the entrance of Bay 3 and stood there. Not inside, just at the threshold, watching. Dr. Pallister was 29 years old, 2 months out of residency, and brilliant in the way that very young surgeons who have never been wrong tend to be brilliant, completely, fluently, and without the useful insulation of doubt. He was handsome in a way he was aware of, and he had a habit of framing his clinical decisions as performances, which worked well when the audience was impressed and badly when the audience wasn't. He was currently explaining to his team why the patient's dropping pressure was likely related to volume loss. Claire watched him order the second large-bore IV, watched the nurse on the left struggling to get access in a collapsed vein, watched the monitor show a pressure that was dropping despite fluids going in. She looked at the chest again. Left side not moving. Trachea deviated right, neck veins distending. She stepped into the bay. "Dr. Pallister." He didn't look up. "This bay is managed. I think he has a tension pneumo." That got a look. Not the good kind. "Excuse me?" Left side isn't expanding. Trachea is shifted. JVD is developing. She kept her voice flat and even, clinical, stripped of everything that could be read as challenge. "He needs needle decompression. The fluids aren't going to—" "I can see his chest." Pallister's voice had that particular sharpness of someone who has decided to be offended. "I'm managing the volume. Step out. His pressure's still dropping. Step out. If it's tension, the fluids are making it security." The word landed in the bay like something thrown. 2 of the nurses looked up. The tech by the crash cart stilled. Pallister pointed at Claire with the kind of certainty that came from never having had to question himself in a room full of people. "Get her out of here." Marissa Holt appeared from somewhere, because Marissa Holt always appeared when she was least wanted and most effective. She took Claire by the arm, not roughly, just firmly, the way you move someone who you've decided isn't worth the argument, and pulled her back toward the curtain. "Do not make this worse," Marissa said quietly. "He's going to die," Claire said, equally quietly. Not a threat, a fact. "Go back to bed 7. The monitor in Bay 3 alarmed. Not the routine alarm. The one that meant the heart was doing something catastrophic. Claire heard Pallister's voice change, the fluency faltering, the confidence cracking just slightly at the edges. "BP? What's his—" "52/30, someone said. "Get me. Rates dropping. 60. 58. Claire turned back toward the bay. Marissa stepped into her path. "Don't you dare!" Claire moved around her. Not shoved. Not pushed. Simply moved, with the precise economy of someone who had learned a long time ago how to navigate through resistance without creating friction, and walked into Bay 3. "I need a 14-gauge needle," she said. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, left side." "Someone remove her from this," Pallister started. "Now," Claire said. Her voice was different. It hadn't been different before, in the doorway when she was asking. She was not asking now. The difference was subtle, not volume, not aggression, but it was there, and the nurse nearest the supply cart responded to it the way people respond to a certain quality of command when they hear it. She turned and grabbed the needle without fully understanding why. Pallister was still talking. Claire had already swabbed the site. The needle went in, a rush of air. The monitor that had been screaming quieted in stages. First the rate steadied, then the pressure climbed. 10 points, 15, 20, the number moving in the right direction for the first time in 4 minutes. The room was very still. Pallister said nothing. The nurse who had handed Claire the needle was looking at her hands as if they'd done something without her permission. And on the table, Dale Merritt's eyes opened. He was somewhere between here and not, the shallow surface of consciousness that comes with massive blood loss and the aftermath of a near-fatal pressure collapse. His eyes moved without fixing on anything, drifting, and then they found Claire. He stared at her. She was already pulling back, hands still gloved, not looking at his face, focused on the clinical picture, watching his O2 sats climb. She had work to do. There was always work to do. His lips moved. She almost didn't hear it. The monitor was still running. Someone was calling out vitals. Pallister had found his voice again and was directing the team with the energy of someone trying to reclaim territory. There was noise everywhere, but she heard it. "It can't be, you." She looked at him then, really looked. He was in his early 50s, dark hair gone mostly gray. A jaw that had been strong before the blood loss had turned him gray pale. The face of someone who had spent a long time outdoors in hard conditions. The kind of face she had seen in certain places, at certain hours, where you didn't ask names and you trusted the person beside you because your life depended on it. She looked at him, and something cold moved through her chest. She did not say anything. She completed the assessment, verified the decompression was holding, relayed the critical information to the trauma team in 2 clean sentences, and walked out of Bay 3. Her hands were steady. They had been steady the whole time. Marissa found her at the medication station 20 minutes later. The shift wasn't over. There were still patients. Claire had gone back to Gerald's sprained wrist and finished the discharge paperwork and moved on to a 14-year-old with a laceration that needed 4 sutures. She was pulling the suture kit when Marissa's footsteps stopped behind her. Pallister filed a report. Claire picked up the forceps. "Okay." "It's an incident report, Claire. Insubordination, unauthorized intervention. He's recommending we initiate termination proceedings." "The patient's alive." "That's not the... His SATs are 96. His pressure's holding. He's alive." Claire turned. "Whatever Pallister's recommending, the patient is alive." Marissa's expression didn't shift. It rarely did. That was one of the things about her. She had excised the readable reactions, kept only the ones that served her. "I've already spoken to hospital administration. Given the circumstances, they feel the appropriate action is suspension pending review. Effective end of shift tonight." Claire held her gaze. "And if I'd stood in the hallway and let him die?" "You were told to stand down." "I've been told a lot of things in this building." Marissa's chin lifted slightly. "You've been here 6 years, Donovan, and you have never understood how this floor works. I don't know where you came from. I don't know what you did before, and frankly, I don't care. What I care about is that you undermined a physician in front of his entire team and violated direct orders from charge staff. That's not heroics. That's a liability." "Call it whatever you want," Claire said. "Can I finish my patient?" A beat. Then Marissa stepped aside. Claire turned back to the suture tray. She kept her face neutral. She was good at that. Had been good at it for years. In rooms considerably more hostile than a Montana emergency room. She sutured the laceration in 4 neat, efficient passes, applied the dressing, gave the instructions for wound care to the teenager's mother, and wrote the discharge summary. She was finishing the chart when her phone buzzed. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. 7 digits, no area code prefix, which meant it had been routed manually. She stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Merritt, D. "Request to speak, private, tonight if possible." She read it twice. She typed, "Who is this?" The response came in under 10 seconds. "Someone who owes you a debt that hasn't expired. Room 4 North. He's asking for you by name, not the name on your badge." Claire set the phone face down on the nursing station counter. Around her, the ER moved through its rhythms, the low-grade constant motion of a department that didn't stop. A monitor somewhere chimed. A family down the hall was asking about wait times. The fluorescent lights did what fluorescent lights do. She picked the phone back up. The message was still there. Not the name on your badge. She had worked very hard for a very specific number of years to make sure nobody in this building knew any name other than the one on her badge. She pulled her jacket from her locker, clocked out 4 minutes before the end of her shift, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Room 4 North was a private room at the end of the post-operative corridor, separated from the main surgical ward by a set of double doors that required a key card. Claire's ER badge shouldn't have gotten her through those doors. It did. She pushed through and walked the length of the corridor. It was quiet here. The specific quiet of a floor where the patients were sedated and the monitors were steady, and the night staff had reached that point in the shift where they moved with maximum efficiency and minimum noise. A nurse she didn't recognize nodded at her from the station without asking for identification. She stopped at the door of 4 North, pushed it open. Dale Merritt was propped at 30 degrees, a nasal cannula delivering supplemental oxygen, an IV running wide in his right arm. The bruising across his clavicle suggested significant trauma beyond the gunshot wound. Whatever had happened to him hadn't happened neatly. His face was still gray pale, but his eyes were open, and they were sharp in a way that the eyes of someone this injured had no business being. He was not alone. The man standing at the window was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia. But he stood the way military men stand when they're trying not to look military, which is to say, he didn't quite succeed. He assessed Claire in the 3 seconds it took her to cross the threshold, catalogued her, and gave a single small nod. "Close the door," he said. Claire closed the door. "Sit down," Merritt said. "I'm fine standing." His mouth twitched, something that might have been appreciation. "Yeah, you always were." He shifted against the pillow, winced, decided against whatever adjustment he'd been planning. "You didn't tell them." "Tell them what?" "Who you are. What you did." "There's nothing to tell," Claire said. "I'm an ER nurse. I caught attention pneumo. It's not complicated." "Claire." His voice dropped. Not soft, just different. The voice of someone cutting through a layer of performance. "I know what you walked away from. I know why. I'm not here to drag it back." He glanced at the man by the window who hadn't moved. "But what happened in that ER tonight? That wasn't a nurse catching something the surgeon missed. That was a trauma specialist operating at a level that most combat medics never reach. And the people who are going to look at those charts tomorrow morning are going to have questions." "Let them have questions." "The charge nurse is already talking," the man by the window said. His voice was quieter than Merritt's, more measured. "Pallister's report went to hospital administration 45 minutes ago. They're convening a review board at 8 a.m. The recommended outcome is full termination and referral to the state nursing board." Claire's expression didn't change. "I know." "You know," the man repeated. "I was told at the end of my shift." Merritt exhaled. It sounded like it cost him something. "You saved my life tonight. Twice, actually, though you don't know the first time counts yet." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to let them do this." "You don't have a say." "I might have more say than you think." He held her gaze. "There are things about tonight that aren't what they look like. Things about this hospital that aren't what they look like. And there are people who've been waiting for a reason to take a closer look at Lakemont General who now have one." He paused. "The question is whether you're going to let me help, or whether you're going to walk out of here and go down alone because you'd rather not be seen." Claire stood at the foot of his bed. The monitor beeped with that steady regularity that meant everything was currently, precariously, holding. She looked at the man by the window. She looked back at Merritt. "What happened to you tonight?" she said. "Who shot you?" Merritt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's a longer conversation." "Then start talking," Claire said. "Because I'm not agreeing to anything I don't understand, and I'm not walking out of here until I understand what you meant when you said twice." The man at this window moved for the first time since she'd entered, turned away from the glass, toward the room, and reached into his jacket for something. He set it on the table beside Merritt's bed. A photograph. Old, printed on photo paper, the colors slightly faded the way things faded before everything went digital. A field location. She could tell from the background, the type of vehicles, the particular quality of the light. 2 people in the image. One of them was a younger version of Dale Merritt, maybe 15 years younger, in uniform. The other was Claire. She hadn't seen that photograph in 11 years. The room was very quiet. "The review board meets at 8 a.m., the man by the window said. Claire picked up the photograph. She looked at it for a moment, put it back down. "Get some rest," she told Merritt. "You lost a significant amount of blood." She walked to the door. "Claire." His voice stopped her at the threshold. She didn't turn. "They're not just coming after you," he said. "They've been at this for a long time. You're not the first one they've done this to, but you might be the last, if you don't disappear on us again." She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she stepped out into the corridor and let the door swing shut behind her. Her hands were still steady. They had been steady the whole time. But in the elevator going down, when the doors slid closed and she was alone in the small lit box of it, she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. 11 years. She had given 11 years to becoming someone else. Someone quiet. Someone background. Someone that rooms like that trauma bay slid right past without looking. She opened her eyes when the elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. She walked out. Her badge read Claire Donovan, RN, Emergency. The photograph upstairs said something else entirely. And somewhere above her, in a private room at the end of a corridor that her badge shouldn't have opened, a man who had once known her under a different name was making phone calls she couldn't hear to people she hadn't spoken to in over a decade about a hospital that had just made the last mistake it would ever make quietly. She slept 4 hours. Not because 4 hours was enough, it hadn't been for years, but because her body had learned in another life to take what was available and function on it without complaint. She was back in her apartment by 1:30 in the morning, out of her scrubs and under the shower for exactly 6 minutes, and in bed by 2. Her alarm was set for 6. She lay in the dark and did not think about the photograph. She thought about Dale Merritt's chest, the asymmetry of it, the way the left side had lagged behind, the small window between catching it and missing it entirely. She thought about the needle going in, the rush of air. She slept. When the alarm went off, she was already awake. She made coffee in the kitchen of her apartment, which was small and clean and contained almost nothing decorative. A bookshelf with medical texts and 3 novels she'd read twice each. A single photograph on the windowsill, facing inward, not the kind with people in it. A mountain range. Somewhere she'd been that she didn't have a better word for than beautiful and hadn't tried to find one. She drank the coffee standing at the counter, watching the gray light come up over Ashford. The town sat in a valley that the mountains cupped on 3 sides, and in the early morning the whole thing looked like something that hadn't quite decided to exist yet. She had moved here deliberately, not randomly. There was a difference, even if nobody at Lakemont General had ever thought to ask about it. She was dressed and out the door by 6:40. The review board met at 8. She had time to think, and she used it badly, not by catastrophizing, which wasn't in her nature, but by running the variables in a loop that kept returning to the same problem. She didn't know how much the man by the window knew. She didn't know what Merritt had already put in motion. She didn't know how much of last night's call record she could trust, or who at Lakemont had already received a version of events shaped by Pallister's report. What she did know, what she had always known, in the places where her instincts were most reliable, was that the moment you walked into a room reactive, you'd already lost half the ground. She needed to be something other than reactive. She turned the car around before she reached the hospital entrance, drove 3 blocks east, and parked outside a diner that opened at 6. She went in, ordered toast and eggs she barely touched, and sat in a booth by the window with her phone on the table. At 7:12, the phone buzzed. The same routed number as the night before. Board composition confirmed. 3 administrators. Pallister's department chief. Holt as witness. They've already drafted the termination letter. This is not a real review. Don't go in unarmed. She read it twice. Then, what does unarmed mean in this context? The response took longer this time, nearly 2 minutes. It means bring everything you have. Whatever you've been protecting, whatever version of yourself you've been keeping quiet, today is not the day for quiet. She set the phone face down on the table. Around her, the diner moved through its morning rhythms. A man in a work jacket reading something on his tablet. 2 women at the counter talking about someone's wedding. The cook behind the pass-through window whistling something without a recognizable tune. The world at 7 in the morning, going about its business, entirely unaware that in approximately 45 minutes, a room full of people who had made up their minds were going to invite Claire Donovan in and explain to her, with the procedural courtesy of a system that had decided she was a problem, exactly what they intended to do with her. She ate half the toast, left a tip that was probably too large, walked back to her car. The administration wing of Lakemont General occupied the northeast corner of the 3rd floor, carpeted, quieter than the clinical floors, with the particular atmosphere of a place designed to make decisions about other places. Claire checked in with the administrative assistant at 8:02 and was shown to a conference room that smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long in the faint industrial lemony scent of cleaned surfaces. 5 people were seated when she walked in. She clocked them in the time it took to cross from the door to the empty chair at the far end of the table. Dr. Harold Vance, Department Chief of Emergency Medicine, 61, heavy-set. A man who had spent 2 decades building a department he was protective of in the way people are protective of things they see as extensions of themselves. He did not make eye contact when she entered. Delia Marsh, hospital COO. Trim, precise, a woman who approached institutional problems the way an accountant approaches a ledger, imbalance. Her pen was already uncapped. Gerald Forsyth, hospital administrator, the one with actual authority in the room, silver-haired, practiced at the particular brand of institutional empathy that preceded decisions that had already been made. He gave her the smile first. Claire had seen that smile on different faces in different rooms, and she knew exactly what it cost the person wearing it. Marissa Holt, seated to the left, hands folded on the table, not looking at Claire with hostility, just looking. Neutral in the way that required effort. And Marcus Pallister, positioned at the edge of the table in a way that suggested he'd claimed the seat least associated with authority while still being present, which was its own kind of move. Claire sat down. "Thank you for coming in," Forsyth said. She said nothing. This was not rudeness. It was the calibrated response of someone who understood that opening statements were frequently traps. Forsyth nodded, as if she'd said something agreeable. "I want to start by saying that we recognize last night was a difficult situation. The patient outcome was, well, it was good. The patient is stable. That's not in dispute." "But," Delia Marsh said, because someone always said but. "But the method," Forsyth continued, "created significant concerns. Dr. Pallister filed a formal incident report. Charge Nurse Holt has provided a written statement. And frankly, what the incident report describes constitutes a serious breach of protocol. Unauthorized entry into an active trauma bay, overriding direct orders from both charge staff and the attending physician, and performing a procedure without— I'm a licensed registered nurse," Claire said. "In the state of Montana, an RN can perform needle thoracostomy in a life-threatening emergency when the patient is in acute deterioration and the responsible physician has not initiated the intervention." A small silence. Pallister's jaw moved slightly. "That's technically accurate," Vance said, with the tone of a man choosing words that would accomplish something specific. "In certain circumstances. But you were told— I was told to leave. The patient's systolic dropped to 52 before I stepped back into the bay. The trachea was visibly deviated. JVD was present. 3 classic indicators of tension pneumothorax. The intervention was indicated, urgent, and within my legal scope." She paused. "The patient is alive." "The patient is alive," Forsyth agreed pleasantly, "and we're very glad of that. But the manner in which— I want to understand something," Claire said. "Are you initiating termination proceedings because a patient survived?" Marissa's hand shifted on the table, just slightly. "That's not what this is," Pallister said. His voice was controlled. He'd rehearsed this, she could tell. "What you did was undermine the authority of the attending physician in front of the entire trauma team. Regardless of the clinical outcome, that kind of behavior creates chaos in a trauma setting. It teaches staff that it's acceptable to— It teaches staff to recognize a tension pneumothorax," Claire said. "Claire." Vance's voice had the register of someone applying pressure they expected to be felt. "You've been a source of friction on this floor for some time. Charge Nurse Holt has documented repeated instances of— I'd like to see that documentation." "Excuse me?" "The documentation. If there are documented instances, I'd like to see them. I haven't received any formal written warnings. I haven't had a performance review in 18 months. If there's a file, I'd like to see what's in it." The room shifted in the small, barely perceptible way that rooms shift when someone does something that wasn't accounted for in the plan. Delia Marsh made a note. Forsyth recovered first. He was practiced at recovery. "Of course. We can certainly make that available. This morning, what I'd like— The letter," Marissa said. Everyone looked at her. "Gerald." Her voice was quiet and precise. "We discussed this. The letter is already prepared. The longer we extend this, the more complicated the legal picture," Claire said. Silence. "If you produce a termination letter this morning, before I've had the opportunity to review my personnel file, before I've had legal counsel present, and before any formal investigation has been completed into the clinical events of last night, you have a problem." She kept her voice exactly even. "Not because I'm threatening litigation, because the patient is alive in room 4 North, and he is going to be asked about what happened in that trauma bay, and what he says is going to be on the record." Pallister leaned forward. "He's sedated. His account— He was conscious when he said my name." She looked at Pallister steadily. "He was conscious when he raised his hand. 3 nurses saw it. The trauma tech saw it. You were in the room." She paused. and he asked to speak to me last night. By name. Which means he knows who I am. Which means whoever he is not a patient that this hospital wants to handle incorrectly." The room was very quiet. Forsyth had stopped smiling. "I think," he said carefully, "it might be worth a brief recess before we proceed." They gave her the hallway. She stood near a window that looked out over the parking structure and listened to the muffled conversation behind the closed conference room door without trying to make out words. She wasn't interested in words. She was interested in the tone, and the tone told her that what she'd said had landed somewhere useful. Her phone buzzed. "They're stalling." "That's good." "Stalling means they're recalculating," she typed. "They have a termination letter prepared." Marissa pushed for it. Of course she did. How much does Pallister know about who Merritt is? She thought about this. Unknown. He knows the name. Probably looked him up. What did he find? Whatever the public record shows. There was a pause. Then, "The public record is going to change in about 6 hours. Thought you should know." She stared at the message. "What does that mean?" she typed. The response didn't come. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to watching the parking structure. A silver sedan was pulling in. A man in a gray suit got out, moved with the same not quite concealed quality as the man who had been standing at Merritt's window last night. He didn't look up at the building. He walked toward the main entrance with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had already been there in their head 3 times before arriving. She tracked him until he disappeared through the entrance doors. The conference room door opened. "Ms. Donovan," Forsyth said, "we're ready." They did not produce the termination letter. What they produced instead was a suspension, paid, pending formal investigation, which was its own language for "we're not done, but we're not committing yet." Forsyth read the terms with the practiced gravity of a man who understood optics. Claire listened to all of it. She signed the acknowledgement form, which confirmed receipt but not agreement, a distinction she made explicit and that Delia Marsh noted. Pallister left the room without speaking to her. Marissa passed her in the doorway and said quietly, "You should think about whether this fight is worth it." Claire looked at her. "He was 60 seconds from dead." "That's not what this is about." "I know it isn't." Marissa held her gaze for a moment, then walked away down the carpeted corridor, her footsteps precise and regular, a woman moving toward the next task with the efficiency of someone who did not lose sleep over much. Claire rode the elevator down. She did not go to the 4th floor. She did not go to room 4 north. She went to the main entrance and pushed through the glass doors into the cold Montana morning and stood on the sidewalk and breathed the air, which was sharp and clean in the way that Ashford's air always was at this hour. And she thought about the man in the gray suit. She thought about the message. The public record is going to change in about 6 hours. She thought about Dale Merritt's face in that trauma bay, the way his eyes had found hers through all that noise and effort and loss, the specific quality of recognition in them. Not surprise. Something closer to relief, which was worse, because relief meant he had been hoping. She walked to her car. She drove. Not home. Not anywhere with a destination, for a while. Just the streets of Ashford in the mid-morning, a Tuesday. The kind of day that was happening in the town around her with complete indifference to anything occurring in the northeast corner of the 3rd floor of Lakemont General. She drove past the school where a group of kids were doing something organized on the field, past the hardware store and the bakery and the small independent pharmacy that had been there since before the hospital expanded. She drove until she reached the edge of town where the road opened up and the valley spread out and the mountains were clear enough to see the snow line, and then she pulled over. Her phone rang. The number on the screen was one she recognized. She had not seen it in 11 years. It had not changed. She answered. "Major Donovan." The voice was graveled, unhurried, exactly as she remembered it. She had heard it in field conditions, in debriefs, in the specific silence of post-mission hours when nobody wanted to talk, and sometimes someone did anyway. "I'm not a major anymore," she said. "That's debatable," Colonel Ruth Sayers said. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." "You always say that." "Because I'm always fine." A sound that might have been a short laugh. "Merritt briefed me this morning. I want to hear your version." Claire looked at the mountain line. A hawk, or something hawk-shaped, was working a thermal above the ridge. making the same wide circle repeatedly with the patience of something that could afford to wait. Tension pneumo. Nobody caught it. I caught it. Decompressed. He's stable. And before that? Last year. Kandahar. She went still. Kandahar isn't public record. No, but it's on the record that matters. And it's relevant to what's about to happen at that hospital. Sayer's voice shifted. Not softer, but more direct. The way it shifted when the pleasantries were done and the actual thing needed to be said. I know you walked away. I know why. I'm not calling to argue that decision. I'm calling because what Merritt's team has been doing, what got him shot last night, is connected to something that goes through Lakemont, through the hospital. And there are people who've been building a case for a while who now have a reason to move. Claire said nothing. Holt has been flagging patients, Sayers said, specific patients, referral patterns that route certain admissions to certain attending physicians. It took a while to see the shape of it because it's buried in 5 years of records, but the pattern's there. Pallister is the newest piece. He's not the architect. He's too young, but he's been useful. The hawk broke off its circle and dropped, fast and precise, and disappeared below the ridgeline. Claire watched the empty air where it had been. Useful to whom? She said. That's what the investigation is going to answer. Merritt's presence last night wasn't random. He was being moved through Ashford on a transport that got interdicted. Whoever shot him knew the route, which means someone who shouldn't have had that information did. A pause. The hospital sits at the center of something we've been trying to name for 2 years. Your incident last night, the report Pallister filed, the suspension, that's going to accelerate the timeline. How? Because now we have grounds to go in. Not quietly, not with a single investigator asking questions. A formal federal medical audit triggered by a whistleblower complaint, running concurrent with the inquiry into the interdiction attempt on a protected witness transport. She paused again, and this time the pause had weight to it. You are the whistleblower complaint, Claire, whether you want to be or not. What you saw in that trauma bay, what they're doing to you right now for seeing it, that's the door. Claire's hand tightened on the phone, not out of fear, out of the specific, controlled anger of someone who had built a quiet life out of careful decisions and was now watching it become useful to a story larger than anything she'd consented to. I didn't consent to being a door, she said. I know that. I left. I left for reasons. I know that too. Then you know that whatever I'm being asked to do right now is, nobody's asking you to do anything, Sayers said. That's the point. You already did it. You walked into that bay. You performed the decompression. You went to that review board this morning, and you didn't disappear. You've already made the choices. Now I'm telling you what those choices mean, so you're not blindsided when things move. A beat. And things are going to move, quickly, today. The road in front of her was empty, no other cars. The valley quiet in the mid-morning cold. The mountains patient and enormous. The way things are patient and enormous when they've been there longer than any version of the trouble unfolding at their feet. Dale said I saved him twice, Claire said. He said I didn't know the first time counted yet. Kandahar, Sayers said. The medevac you called in, the field intervention you ran before extraction. The medic who was supposed to be on that transport was compromised. You stepped in. Merritt was the package. He wasn't identified to you. Protocol. But the intervention you performed kept him viable for extraction. A pause. You didn't know who he was. You just saw a soldier who needed help. Claire was quiet for a moment. He's been carrying that for 11 years, Sayers said. When he opened his eyes last night and saw you standing in that ER, the same person, different room, different decade, he thought he was hallucinating from blood loss. Something in her voice shifted, not to softness exactly, but to something adjacent. He wasn't. Claire pressed her thumb and forefinger against the bridge of her nose. Not distress. Recalibration. The brain doing the quiet work of fitting new information against existing structure, finding the load-bearing pieces, deciding what held. What happens today? She said finally. Federal investigative team lands in Ashford at 1400 hours. They will present credentials at the hospital at approximately 1500. Concurrent with that, Merritt's JAG officer will be filing a formal protective complaint on your behalf regarding the suspension. And sometime between now and end of business, someone is going to sit down with Marissa Holt and ask her some questions she has never been asked before. Claire lowered her hand, started the car. "Where are you going?" Sayers asked. "Home," Claire said. "I need to eat something real. And I need to not be driving when things start moving, because if I'm driving, I can't think clearly. That's practical." "I'm a practical person." A brief silence. Then quietly. And this was the one moment in the call that sounded less like a senior officer and more like a woman who had also made hard choices and knew what they cost. "You did good last night, Claire. Both times. 11 years apart, and both times." Claire put the car in drive. "He needed help," she said. "Both times." She drove back toward town. Whoa. She was at her kitchen table with a bowl of soup she'd assembled from whatever was in her refrigerator. Not well planned, slightly too much black pepper. When the call came from a number she didn't know but answered anyway, because after this morning she had decided that unknown numbers deserved an answer. "Ms. Donovan," a woman's voice, younger than Sayers, clipped and efficient. "This is Special Agent Dana Voss, HHS Office of Inspector General. I'll be arriving in Ashford this afternoon with the team. I'd like to speak with you prior to our entry into Lakemont General. Would you be available at 1300? Claire looked at her soup. "Yes. I'll send an address. Thank you for your time." The line disconnected. She ate the soup. All of it, too much pepper, and all. Washed the bowl. Stood at the sink and watched the mountain range through the kitchen window. The hawk was back, or a different hawk, it was impossible to know, working the same air above the same ridge. At 11:40, her phone buzzed with a text from a number she recognized as one of the ER nurses from the overnight shift. A woman named Bev, 54, 22 years at Lakemont, who had worked alongside Claire for 3 years and had once covered her break when Claire's patient was crashing and had never mentioned it or asked for anything in return. "Heard what they did this morning. I want you to know. I saw the whole thing last night. What you did, what they did after. I wrote it down. All of it. I don't know if that matters, but I have it." Claire read the message twice. "It matters," she wrote back. "Please keep it safe." At 12:15, Pallister made a move nobody anticipated. She found out about it from the same routed number, the one she was beginning to think of as Merritt's channel, though she suspected it belonged to the man in the gray suit, who had a function in this she hadn't yet fully mapped. Pallister called the state nursing board directly, filed a complaint, claims you performed a procedure without physician oversight, and that the documentation in the patient's chart has been altered. She stared at the message. "The chart hasn't been altered," she typed. "No. But his complaint says it has, which means someone either altered it after the fact to support his claim, or he's lying and they'll find that out when they pull the original time-stamped record. Either way, the nursing board will open a file. You could be looking at a temporary license suspension pending investigation." She set the phone down on the table, picked it up. "Can that be stopped?" "Not stopped. But the federal audit will pull all records, including audit logs that show any post hoc alterations. If someone touched that chart after the fact, there's a digital trail." A pause. She could feel the pause, the weight of the next sentence forming. But if Pallister managed to have it done in the window between last night and this morning, before anyone thought to preserve the original, there may be a version of the record that looks bad for you on paper. She thought about this. She thought about Marissa Holt, who had been in the building from 7 a.m., who had access to patient records as charge nurse, who had made a phone call at the end of the board meeting. Claire had seen it, Marissa walking away down the carpeted corridor with her phone already in her hand. She thought about Bev's text. "I saw the whole thing last night. I wrote it down. Witness accounts were not chart records, but they were something." She typed, "Is there a way to flag the original record for preservation before the audit team arrives?" The response took 4 minutes, already in motion. But here's the problem. If Pallister's complaint triggers a nursing board action before 1400, they may have grounds to request you not be present for the federal investigative interview. It's a procedural question, but in the wrong hands it becomes a way to keep you out of the room. She pushed back from the table, stood. This was the move. She saw it now. Not a defensive move, not a panic response. A chess move, deliberate and prepared, which meant Pallister had not acted alone this morning. Someone had told him to make this call. Someone who understood that the way to neutralize a witness was not to silence them after the fact, but to preemptively question their credibility and standing before the fact. Someone who knew something was coming. She picked up her jacket. She had 2 hours before the federal team arrived. 2 hours in which someone was working a specific strategy to make her into a problem instead of a witness. And the only counter to that strategy was to not be in her apartment waiting for it to find her. She pulled the jacket on, grabbed her keys. Her phone buzzed one more time. The routed number. One line. Don't go to the hospital. She paused at her door. Then, where then? No response came. She stood at the door for 10 seconds. Then she thought about what Sayers had said. You already made the choices. She thought about Bev, who had written it all down and kept it safe. She thought about Dale Merritt raising a trembling hand in a trauma bay to salute a woman that nobody in the room knew to look at. She thought about Pallister on the phone to the nursing board, and whoever was on the other end of his calculation, and the careful architecture of a lie being constructed in real time. She put her hand on the door handle, and then her phone rang. Not the routed number, not Sayers, not Voss. A local number. A Lakemont number. She looked at it for a moment before answering. Ms. Donovan. A voice she didn't recognize. Male, low, careful. My name is James Ehrlich. I'm the attending physician in the ICU. We have a situation with your patient, with Commander Merritt. I need you here, now, not in 10 minutes. Her hand tightened on the phone. What kind of situation? A pause that told her everything before he spoke. Someone accessed his room, Ehrlich said, and his chart has been flagged for transfer to a different facility. The paperwork came through hospital administration 40 minutes ago. His voice dropped. If he leaves this building, I don't know what happens to him. And I don't think you do either. She was already moving before Ehrlich finished the sentence. Keys in hand, jacket half on, she pushed through her apartment door and took the stairs instead of the elevator, because the elevator had a tendency to pause between floors, and she didn't have time for pauses. The cold hit her in the parking lot, sharp, the kind that came off the mountains in the late morning when the valley hadn't warmed yet. And she unlocked the car without breaking stride and had it in reverse before the door was fully closed. What does the transfer paperwork say? She said into the phone. Billings. Billings Regional Trauma. The listed reason is specialist consultation for complex wound management. Ehrlich's voice was tight, not panicked. She could hear him working to stay on the clinical side of this, which she respected. His wound management is not complex. He's post-decompression, stable vitals, the GSW is clean through and through, no surgical intervention required. There is no clinical basis for this transfer. Who signed it? That's the thing. The attending signature is Pallister's, but Pallister isn't Merritt's attending. I am, and I didn't authorize this. The paperwork went through patient transport coordination directly, bypassing my sign-off entirely. She turned onto the main road, heading toward the hospital. Has transport been notified? The request is in the system. If it processes, they'll send a unit. The window on these things, once it's in the queue, it can move in under an hour. Can you block it? A pause. I flagged it as unauthorized, but I've been told that administration has already reviewed and approved, which means whoever did this went up the chain before they came to me, and by the time I found out, the approvals were already in place. She thought about Forsyth, the practiced smile, the recess he'd called to recalculate. Stay in the building, she said. Don't leave the floor. Don't let transport into that room until I'm there. I'm an attending physician, Ms. Donovan. I can delay for clinical reasons, but I can't. Tell them you need to complete a reassessment before he's moved. That's within your rights. Tell them there's an outstanding lab result. Anything that buys 20 minutes. She was doing 70 on a road that suggested 55, and she didn't adjust. 20 minutes. Can you do that? Ehrlich was quiet for a moment. I'll see what I can do. She pressed the phone harder to her ear. One more thing. The man in the room with Merritt last night, gray jacket, didn't identify himself. Is he still in the building? I haven't seen him this morning. If you see him, he needs to know what's happening right now. She disconnected and dialed the routed number. It went to a tone she'd never heard before. Not voicemail, not a disconnect signal, something in between that lasted 4 seconds and then dropped the call entirely. She tried again. Same tone, same 4 seconds. Gone. The channel was closed. She wasn't going to waste time on what that meant. She kept driving. She made it to the hospital in 11 minutes, which was 2 minutes faster than the trip had any right to be. She parked in the first open spot she found, which was in the physician lot and not hers to use. and walked through the main entrance at a pace that was not quite running. The specific controlled urgency of hospital movement, fast enough to cover ground, composed enough not to alarm anyone she passed. The elevator banks were busy. She took the stairs again. Fourth floor. The double doors of Postoperative North required her badge, and she held her breath for the half second it took the reader to process, because a suspended employee's access could theoretically be revoked, and she didn't know if anyone had thought to do that yet. The light went green. She pushed through. Ehrlich was waiting at the nursing station. Late 40s, a slight man with the kind of perpetual alertness that ICU attendings developed after years of watching stable patients become unstable without warning. He looked at her with visible relief that he was trying not to show. "Transport coordinator called up 10 minutes ago," he said, low. "I told them his O2 sats were running inconsistent and I wanted a repeat chest film before he moved. They bought it. But the coordinator is checking with administration, and I've probably got 15 minutes before someone overrides me." "Where is he?" "Room. He's been asking questions. He knows something's happening." Ehrlich hesitated. "There's also a man here who says he's with the JAG office. He arrived about 30 minutes ago, didn't have any paperwork, showed identification I couldn't verify, and has been standing in the hallway outside the room since." Claire turned. Down the corridor outside room 4 North, a man in a dark jacket was leaning against the wall with his arms folded. Not the same man as last night. This one was younger, broader in the shoulders, with the particular stillness of someone doing an active job that looked like nothing. She walked toward him. He watched her approach without moving. When she was close enough, he said, "Donovan," without inflection, as if confirming an identification from a photograph. "Who sent you?" she said. "Same person who sent you the photograph last night." He unfolded his arms. "Transfer request was flagged to our team 40 minutes ago. We've been trying to reach the channel you've been using, but there was a complication. The routing got flagged at the hospital's end, which means someone in the IT infrastructure here is monitoring outbound contact associated with Merritt's room." She looked at him. "They're watching the communications." "Have been, probably since last night, which means they know the timeline. They know federal investigators are coming this afternoon." He kept his voice entirely level, the words spaced with deliberate calm. "The transfer is a move to get Merritt out of federal jurisdiction before the audit team arrives. If he's at Billings Regional, which is outside the scope of the HHS action as currently drafted, his testimony is not immediately accessible." "Can the audit scope be expanded?" "It can. Takes time. Time is what they're buying." She looked at the door to room 4 North. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing you haven't already done. Your role here is to be a witness. What I need is for you to go into that room, tell Merritt what's happening, and help us buy the time we need." He paused. "Voss moved her timeline up. She's landing at 1310 instead of 1400. She'll be at the hospital by 1400 at the latest, which means we need Merritt in this building for 2 more hours." 2 hours. Ehrlich had 15 minutes of legitimate clinical delay. The math was not favorable. She pushed the door open. Merritt was sitting up higher than he'd been the night before, which told her his pressure was better and his breathing was easier. He tracked her the moment she entered with eyes that were alert in a way that contradicted how much blood he'd lost 12 hours ago. The body's insistence on continuing, she'd always thought, was one of the more stubborn things about it. "They're trying to move me," he said before she could speak. "Yes." "Billings?" "Yes." He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd already worked out. "Pallister." Pallister's signature, probably not Pallister's idea. He shifted, and the shift cost him something. She watched his jaw set against it. "How long do we have?" "Ehrlich is buying time, maybe 15 minutes of clinical cover. After that, whoever approved the transfer administratively is going to override him." Merritt looked at the window. It faced east, the same mountain she'd been watching from the roadside less than 2 hours ago. "The people who shot me last night knew my transport route," he said. "That information was held by 4 people, one of whom is on my team and I'd lay down my life for, which means the other 3. He paused. "One of them is connected to this hospital." She watched his face. "Forsyth?" "I don't have a name yet, but the interdiction happened 12 minutes after my transport departed the staging point. 12 minutes is enough time to make a call, not enough time for a random intercept." His voice was even. Not cold, just stripped of everything that wasn't relevant. Someone in this building made a call, and now someone in this building is trying to get me out of range before the people who can answer that question show up. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat down. The JAG officer outside your door says federal investigators arrive at 1400. I know, Sayers called me this morning. He looked at her directly. I told her what I told you last night. You've been protecting yourself for 11 years. That's a rational response to an irrational situation. I'm not asking you to stop protecting yourself. I'm asking if you're willing to stop protecting yourself from the wrong things. She held his gaze. What does that mean? It means you've been hiding the part of you that's actually most useful, and the people in this building have been counting on that. He let that sit for a moment. Holt has been running this floor like a personal enterprise for years. Pallister is new, but he's being mentored into it. He's not the problem, he's the symptom. The problem is older and it runs deeper, and it has survived this long because everyone who knew what it looked like either got pushed out or decided it wasn't worth the fight. I decided it wasn't worth the fight, Claire said. I know. I still think that was a rational choice. It was, he said, right up until you walked into that trauma bay last night. He let that settle. After that, it stopped being a choice. She looked at her hands. They were resting on her knees, relaxed, the hands of someone who had been in enough charged rooms to not perform tension for an audience. But underneath the stillness, she was doing the math that she always did, assessing, calculating, mapping the terrain. 2 hours. Ehrlich had maybe 12 minutes left of clinical cover now. She stood up. I need to make a call, she said. Sayers? No, someone who can do something in the next 10 minutes that doesn't require a federal authorization. She moved toward the door, then stopped. Don't let them take you out of this room. Whatever they tell you, whatever paperwork they produce, you're a patient with the right to refuse transfer. You know that. He almost smiled. Almost. I've refused worse things than a hospital transfer. I know, she said. I was there for one of them. She walked out. In the corridor, she pulled out her phone and called Bev. 3 rings. 4. Claire. Bev's voice was low. She was on the floor probably, keeping it down. I need something from you. I need you to go to the charge station and pull the activity log on room 4 north for the last 14 hours. Patient record access log. Stamped. Print it and take it off the floor. She kept walking away from the room toward the far end of the corridor where the sound wouldn't carry. Don't do it from your login. Find someone who has administrative pull access and ask them to run it as a QA check. A short silence. Claire, that's going to raise flags. It's already going to raise flags. I need the log before whoever altered that chart realizes they need to alter the access record too. Those are 2 separate systems. There may be a window. She stopped at the end of the corridor. Can you do this? Bev breathed out. Yeah, I know someone in health informatics. He owes me one. How fast? 20 minutes, maybe. I need it in 12. Claire. Bev, someone tried to bury a chart last night to cover a patient nearly dying in the trauma bay. The same people are now trying to move that patient out of this building before investigators arrive. If there's a chain of custody on that record access log, it changes what the investigators can request and how fast they can get it. She kept her voice low and level. 12 minutes. A pause. Then, I'll call you back. She hung up. The JAG officer appeared around the corner at the end of the corridor, moving with controlled speed. We have a problem. Another one. Transport coordinator just called the floor. They're sending a unit, 20 minutes out, not 60. Administration fast-tracked it. He was already moving back toward Merritt's room. Someone pushed the timeline up after Ehrlich's delay request, which means they know we're stalling. She moved with him. Ehrlich can refuse. He already did. Forsyth called the floor directly and told the charge nurse on duty to authorize the transport team's access, regardless of the attending sign-off. He cited an administrative override on clinical authority for discharge and transfer decisions in appropriate circumstances. She stopped walking. That's not a real policy. No. But the charge nurse on duty doesn't know that, and Forsyth is the hospital administrator, and she's 26 years old. He glanced at her. Ehrlich is in there with Merritt now explaining the situation. Merritt can refuse the transfer himself, as you said. But if transport shows up and administration is on site to authorize, the physical dynamic gets complicated. She thought about what complicated meant in this context. A man who had lost significant blood less than 24 hours ago, still on supplemental oxygen, being pressured by institutional authority backed by administrative muscle. Merritt was not someone who would be easily moved against his will, but he was also not at full capacity, and the whole architecture of what was being done to him was designed around that fact. She looked at the JAG officer. "What's your name?" He glanced at her sideways. "Harlan." "Harlan, do you have the authority to post yourself outside that door and prevent non-medical personnel from entering?" "Technically, as a legal representative of a federal, do you or don't you?" "Yes." "Then do that. Don't move from that door." She turned. "I'll be back in 5 minutes." "Where are you going?" She was already walking. She went to the 3rd floor. Not to the administration wing, not to the carpeted, decided quiet of the conference room where she'd signed an acknowledgement form that morning. She went to the medical records suite, which occupied a set of offices at the south end of the 3rd floor and was staffed by 3 people during business hours. She had been here exactly once before, 2 years ago, to pull a chart for a legal deposition involving a patient she'd treated. The woman at the front desk was named Patricia, mid-50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, the settled authority of someone who had been managing the physical and digital life of a hospital's documentation for long enough to know exactly where everybody was buried, metaphorically speaking. Patricia looked up when Claire walked in. "Ms. Donovan." She said the name without surprise, which was itself a thing. "I heard about this morning." "I need something," Claire said. "And I need it fast and I need it clean." Patricia tilted her head slightly. "An invitation, not a commitment. The trauma record from Bay 3 last night. The record of Dale Merritt's treatment from admission to stabilization. I need to know if there's been any modification to that record after the initial documentation was completed." She put both hands on the desk, leaning forward, but not aggressive, deliberate, serious. "Not a copy. Not a printout. I need the audit trail on the record itself. Every access event. Every field that was touched." Patricia studied her for a moment. "That's a records integrity query. I'd normally need—" "Patricia." Claire held her gaze. "How long have you worked here?" 23 years? In 23 years, have you ever seen an attending physician file a complaint claiming a chart was altered when he was the one who most recently had reason to alter it? A long pause. Patricia reached up and adjusted her reading glasses without breaking eye contact. I've seen things, she said carefully, that I've documented and filed and hoped someone would eventually look at. She pulled her keyboard toward her. Audit trail request is a legitimate administrative function. I can run it under routine records integrity review. Her fingers moved. It takes about 4 minutes to generate. I have 4 minutes, Claire said. She stood at the desk while Patricia worked. The record suite was quiet, except for the sound of the keyboard and the low hum of the building's ventilation, and somewhere down the hall, a printer cycling through a job. Normal Tuesday sounds in a place where extraordinary things were not supposed to happen, which is where extraordinary things most reliably happened. At minute 3, Patricia stopped typing. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at Claire. There were 6 access events on this record after 2 a.m., she said. 3 of them are charting documentation, nursing notes, attending notes, lab results. Those are expected. She paused. 2 of them are from a login associated with a charge nurse credential, at 4:17 a.m. and 5:02 a.m., both outside normal charting hours for charge staff. And the 6th, she stopped. What? The 6th access event is from a physician credential, at 6:49 a.m. She turned the monitor slightly so Claire could see the name on the screen. Marcus Pallister. He had logged into the chart at 6:49 in the morning, 3 hours after the charge credential access, and approximately 1 hour before the review board convened. What fields were modified, Claire said. The nursing intervention record. Patricia's voice had gone very careful, very measured. The timestamp on the needle decompression entry, and she leaned closer to the screen. The physician response notation. The original entry documented that the attending physician had not initiated intervention prior to the nursing action. The current version of that field reads, procedure performed by nursing staff in deviation from physician direction. The room was very quiet. Deviation from physician direction. Not physician had not yet acted. Not emergency intervention preceding physician order. Deviation. A word that meant willful transgression, not necessity. A word that, in the nursing board's framework, carried the weight of intentional misconduct. "Patricia," Claire said, "I need you to generate a certified copy of this audit trail, time-stamped, signed, in an envelope, right now." Patricia was already pulling a form from her drawer. "I've been waiting 23 years, she said quietly, "for someone to come in here and ask the right question." The certified envelope was in Claire's hand when her phone buzzed. "Bev." "I got it," Bev said. "My informatics contact ran it as a QA pull, 4:17 and 5:02 a.m., charge nurse credential, room 4 North Record. Also, Claire. Also the incident report from last night. Someone accessed the incident report file at 5:45 a.m. using the same charge credential and added 3 paragraphs to the narrative that were not in the original submission. Do you have it printed?" "In my locker, sealed envelope." "Don't move it until I tell you to." She was already at the stairwell. "And Bev, if anyone asks you anything in the next 2 hours, you talk to no one. You ran a routine check, nothing else." "I know how to keep a secret," Bev said. "I've been keeping the wrong ones for 6 years. I'm ready to keep the right ones." She took the stairs at speed, 3rd floor to 4th, and as she pushed through the stairwell door, she could hear it. Not shouting, nothing so crude as shouting, but the elevated institutional tension of voices carrying an argument in professional registers. She moved down the corridor toward room 4 North, and the sound resolved into shape. 2 men in green transport uniforms were in the hallway. Harlan was in the doorway of the room, physically blocking the entrance in the way that said, "I am willing to be an obstacle, and have made that commitment." Ehrlich was beside him with the specific energy of a physician who has decided to be immovable and is discovering what that costs. Forsyth was there, the administrator himself, which told her they'd escalated, speaking in the measured, authoritative tone of a man who is accustomed to institutional weight doing his work for him. "This is a lawful administrative directive," Forsyth was saying. "The attending's refusal to cooperate with a validated transfer order constitutes—" "The patient has declined transfer," Harlan said. "He has the right to refuse." He was presented with a clinical recommendation that he may not fully understand given his current. "He's a competent adult who speaks English," Ehrlich said. "He understands perfectly." "Mr. Forsyth," Claire's voice cut across all of it, not loud, just precise and timed. Everyone turned. Forsyth looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise into something colder and more calculated in about 2 seconds flat. "I have a certified audit trail from your medical records department showing unauthorized post hoc modification of a patient chart." She held up the envelope. "I also have documentation of 6 access events outside standard charting hours, including physician access at 6:49 a.m. this morning, 53 minutes before the review board convened and 41 minutes before a complaint was filed with the state nursing board." The transport crew looked at each other. Forsyth's jaw worked slightly. "That document was obtained without authorization. It was obtained via routine records integrity review, which is a standard administrative function requiring no special authorization." She kept her voice flat, informational. "If you proceed with this transfer, every action taken this morning will be included in the federal HHS investigative brief that is currently being finalized for a team arriving at this hospital in—" She looked at her watch. 78 minutes. The hallway was completely still. Then Forsyth did something she hadn't predicted. He smiled. It was the same practiced, warm, institutional smile from the conference room, and it was somehow more threatening here because it didn't fit the situation. "Ms. Donovan," he said, "you're a suspended employee who is currently in a section of the hospital she has no clinical authorization to access. Anything you've obtained here is, at best, questionable in provenance. And you are escalating a situation that, if you continue, will result in additional formal complaints against your license." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "I'd encourage you to consider your position." She looked at him. She thought about Patricia, who had spent 23 years documenting things and hoping someone would eventually ask the right question. She thought about Bev, who had written everything down the night before and sealed it in an envelope. She thought about Ehrlich, standing in a doorway deciding what kind of doctor he was going to be. She thought about an empty trauma bay, and a needle, and a choice that had taken approximately 4 seconds and had apparently been building toward this hallway for 11 years. "My position," she said, "is fine." She extended the envelope toward Harlan, who took it without looking at Forsyth for permission. She pulled out her phone. She dialed Voss directly, the number the federal agent had called from that morning, still in her recent log. It rang twice. Donovan. Voss's voice was sharp and immediate. She'd been waiting. You need to know something before you arrive, Claire said. They're attempting to transfer the protected witness out of the facility. Administrative override of attending physician authority. Transport crew is physically present on the 4th floor right now. She paused. I also have documentary evidence of chart alteration executed this morning by a named physician and a charge nurse credential, timestamps confirmed by records integrity audit. She looked directly at Forsyth, who had stopped smiling. I think you'll want to move faster than 1400. A brief pause. Then Voss said, We're 22 minutes out. Do not let that patient leave the building. Working on it, Claire said. She lowered the phone. The transport crew had not moved forward. They were looking at Forsyth with the specific expression of men who had understood that the ground had shifted under this situation and were reassessing whether they wanted to be standing on it. Forsyth's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something happened in his face. A small, rapid reorganization, too fast and too controlled to read clearly. But Claire had spent years in environments where reading faces quickly was a survival skill, and what she read in that half-second was not confidence. He stepped back from the group, turned slightly, answered. She watched his shoulders. She had been watching shoulders for a long time, the way they carried what faces tried to hide. Forsyth's right shoulder dropped approximately 2 centimeters in the first 10 seconds of the call. His head angled forward slightly, the posture of someone receiving information they had not planned to receive. When he turned back, the smile was completely gone. The transport crew picked up on it immediately. The older of the two looked at his partner with the resigned recognition of men who had been called to scenes that turned into something else. We'll hold pending administrative confirmation, the older one said to no one in particular, and both of them moved toward the elevator with the purposeful speed of people extracting themselves from a situation. Harlan stepped back from the doorway, but did not leave his post. Ehrlich exhaled, just once, quietly, through his nose. Forsyth stood in the corridor with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man running a very rapid and private calculation. He looked at Claire. He looked at the envelope in Harlan's hands. He looked at Ehrlich. Then he turned and walked toward the administration wing stairwell without a word. Claire watched him go. Her phone buzzed. The routed number. The channel she'd thought was closed. One line. Voss just sent a preliminary authorization to the U.S. Marshal's office in Billings. They're dispatching to Ashford. Merritt's room is about to become a federal protective environment. She read it. Then, why was the channel closed earlier? The response took only seconds. It wasn't closed. Someone at this hospital was monitoring outbound signals from the 4th floor, and we rerouted. The person who set up that monitoring used an IT credential that belongs to someone in your medical records department. She stood very still. Medical records. Patricia, who had been waiting 23 years for someone to ask the right question, who had been the first person to tell her that the audit trail showed Pallister's access at 6:49, who had generated a certified document and handed it to her in under 4 minutes. She turned and looked back toward the stairwell. Her mind was running the geometry of it, the positions, the timing, the small, deliberate actions that had either broken open the case or carefully shaped what she could see of it. Patricia had given her the audit trail, and someone using a medical records credential had been monitoring the 4th floor communications. Those were 2 separate facts that might have 2 separate explanations. Or they might not. She typed, "The credential. Can you identify the specific account?" The response came, "Yes." And it's not what you're thinking. The credential belongs to a records clerk who left the hospital 14 months ago. Someone has been running active access under a ghost account. She breathed. Not Patricia. A ghost account. Someone maintaining access through a credential that shouldn't still be active in the system, which meant either an IT failure or an IT complicity, and either one was a different kind of problem than she'd been looking at 30 seconds ago. "Send that to Voss," she typed. "Now. Everything." She put the phone in her pocket. Down the corridor, through the double doors, she could hear the elevator arriving. Multiple sets of footsteps. She turned toward the sound and watched the doors open. 3 people stepped through. 2 women and a man, all in business clothing that had the specific quality of people who wore it because the situation required it, rather than because it was their preference. The lead woman, early 40s, compact, with the kind of focused stillness that comes from a career spent entering hostile rooms, looked directly at Claire as she crossed the threshold. "Donovan?" she said. "Voss," Claire said. Dana Voss looked at the corridor, at Harlan, still at his post, at Ehrlich, standing with his arms folded and the expression of a man who had committed to a position and was not moving, at the empty space where the transport crew had been. "Tell me what I'm walking into," Voss said. Claire opened her mouth to answer, and that was when the alarm went off. Not a monitor alarm. Not the routine chime of a floor notification. The full building emergency alarm. The one that meant something structural, something that changed the physical conditions of the entire facility. It was followed, 3 seconds later, by the overhead PA system activating. "All personnel, this is a facility security notification. All non-essential personnel are requested to remain in place. Security teams are responding to an incident in the lower level. Please remain calm." Everyone in the corridor went still. Voss looked at Claire with the sharp, immediate attention of someone whose threat assessment had just recalibrated. "What's in the lower level?" Claire knew the layout of this building. 6 years. She knew where every department sat, where the service corridors ran, where the loading bays were. She knew what was in the lower level. "Medical records," she said. And then she was already moving. Voss moved with her without asking twice. That was the thing about federal investigators. The good ones didn't need everything explained before they committed to a direction. Voss had assessed the corridor, assessed Claire, assessed the alarm, and made a decision in under 3 seconds. Her 2 colleagues fell in behind her with the same economy of motion, and the 4 of them hit the stairwell door together, going down instead of up, the alarm cycling through its steady 2-tone pulse above them as they descended. Claire took the stairs faster than was advisable and didn't slow down. Medical records is the only department in the lower level with access to the system architecture that was being used to monitor 4th-floor communications, she said, one hand on the railing, her voice carrying up the stairwell. "If someone realized we'd identified the ghost account, they'd go for the physical servers," Voss said, right behind her, "or the backup drives. Anything that could corroborate the access log." "Patricia." Claire hit the lower level door. "The records manager. She's been in that office all morning." She pushed through. The lower level of Lakemont General was a different building than the floors above it. Older, the renovation money having traveled upward and run out somewhere around the 2nd floor. The corridors here were narrower, the lighting a cooler fluorescent that had been buzzing at the same frequency for 20 years. Storage. Archives. The facilities office. And at the south end, behind a set of doors with a card reader that was currently propped open with a rubber wedge, medical records. The wedge was wrong. Patricia didn't prop that door. In 6 years of occasionally needing something from records, Claire had never seen that door propped. She went through it fast. The outer office was empty. Patricia's desk was there. The beaded glasses chain draped over the monitor, a coffee cup still steaming slightly, a half-completed form beside the keyboard. But Patricia was not. One of the interior office doors was open, the one that led to the server room, and from inside it came the sounds of someone moving quickly through a confined space. Voss's hand went to her jacket. She looked at Claire. Claire pointed at the open door. Voss went first. Standard entry, efficient, the kind of movement that said this was not her first room she'd cleared. Claire stayed at the threshold. The server room was 8 feet by 12, racks of equipment along 3 walls. The air cool and slightly stale with the particular smell of electronics that ran continuously. A man was crouched at the far rack, not a technician. Wrong clothes, wrong shoes, the wrong quality of hurry. He had a drive pulled halfway from its housing and a laptop bag open on the floor beside him. And when Voss came through the door, he lurched upright, and the drive came with him, still connected by its cable, pulling the cable taut. "Federal investigator," Voss said. "Don't move. Put it down." He didn't put it down. He looked at the drive in his hand and then at Voss and then at the door behind her, and his face ran through 3 calculations in quick succession. Claire had seen that face before. Not this specific man, but this specific calculation. The moment someone who has been operating in the background realizes the background is gone. He put the drive down. Not because Voss told him to, because the drive was still connected and he'd looked at the cable and understood that pulling it would damage the housing, and damaged evidence was still evidence. He was smarter than his position suggested. "Hands," Voss said. Her colleague moved past her and had the man's wrists controlled before Claire finished the thought. She looked at his face. She didn't recognize him from the clinical floors. She'd seen him, twice, she thought, in the past 6 years, in the administrative wing. A face that belonged to a building without belonging to a department. The kind of face that was useful precisely because it was forgettable. Voss looked back at Claire. "You know him?" "Administration," Claire said, "not medical staff." "Name?" Voss directed this at the man. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Voss's second colleague was already on the phone, stepping back into the outer office, speaking in the clipped shorthand of someone coordinating with a team that was presumably arriving faster than originally planned. Claire moved to the server rack. The pulled drive was a backup storage unit. She could see the labeling, a sequential date range that covered the past 8 months. Access logs. Modification records. Everything that the audit trail she'd taken from Patricia would also show, but in a more comprehensive, less selective format. Someone had needed this to disappear in the 9 minutes between Forsyth's phone call in the 4th floor corridor and the building alarm. 9 minutes. That was how long it had taken from the moment Forsyth understood the situation was collapsing to the moment. Someone was dispatched to the lower level to start removing the record of how it had been built. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Patricia was in the doorway of the server room, slightly out of breath, her glasses askew. She looked at the man being restrained by Voss's colleague, and something in her face settled. Not surprise, not satisfaction, something older than both. "How long has he been accessing your systems?" Claire asked. Patricia looked at her. "I found the first anomaly 14 months ago, when Diane left." A pause. Diane, presumably, being the records clerk whose credential had been turned into the ghost account. "I documented it, reported it to IT security, was told it was a system artifact and had been corrected." She looked at the server rack. It hadn't been corrected. It had been noted and protected. IT security reported to who? Facilities management. Patricia straightened her glasses. "Which reports to the COO's office?" Delia Marsh, the woman with the uncapped pen and the ledger balance approach to institutional problems, who had been in the review board room that morning, making notes, saying very little. Claire filed this and moved. When she came back up to the 4th floor, the corridor outside room 4 North had changed in the way that corridors change when federal authority makes itself physical. 2 U.S. Marshals had arrived. She wasn't sure how. The timeline was moving faster than she could fully track. Sayers presumably having activated something from her end. And the room was now formally designated a protective environment, which meant the transfer order was void, and Forsyth's administrative override was worth exactly nothing. Harlan was still at the door. He looked at her when she emerged from the stairwell with Voss and gave a single nod that meant still holding. Ehrlich was at the nursing station, writing something. He looked up. "What happened downstairs?" "Someone tried to pull a backup drive from the server room." He set his pen down. Tried. She stopped at the station. "Where's Forsyth?" "Administration wing. He's been up there since he left this corridor." Ehrlich paused. "His assistant called the floor twice. I don't know what he's doing up there." "I do," Voss said from behind Claire. She had her phone out, reading something. "He made 3 calls from his office in the last 40 minutes. 1 to the hospital's legal counsel, who has already indicated he's not available. 1 to a private attorney in Billings, who took the call. And 1 to a cell number that we're currently identifying." She looked up. "He's not a stupid man. He knows what's coming. He's trying to construct a position before we get to him." "Can you get to him now?" Claire said. "We're working a sequenced approach. The drive attempt downstairs gives us grounds to expand the scope of the preliminary action." Voss pocketed the phone. "We go to him after we've completed evidence preservation on the 4th floor records and the server room. If we move too fast, we get the man but lose the architecture." Architecture. The word that kept coming back. The way these things were built, layer by layer, over years, until they looked like the building itself and not like something inserted into it. "Holt," Claire said. "Marissa Holt." She accessed the chart twice before Pallister logged in. She's the charge credential on the modification records. We know. She's currently on the floor. ER charge. We're not tipping her yet. Voss looked at her steadily. I know that's hard to hear. It wasn't hard to hear, it was hard to feel. The particular friction of watching someone continue to occupy space they'd used to do damage, even temporarily, for strategic reasons. But Claire had spent enough time in environments where strategic patience was a survival requirement to understand the logic. She understood it. She didn't have to be comfortable with it. Pallister, she said, pulled to administrative leave 20 minutes ago. Hospital counsel's office did it, actually, without prompting from us. I think they saw the shape of what was coming and made a self-protective move. Voss almost smiled, something dry and unsurprised. Institutions protecting themselves are sometimes useful. Claire thought about Pallister in the conference room that morning, the way he'd positioned himself at the edge of the table, the energy of someone claiming adjacency to authority without direct exposure. He'd made the nursing board call. He'd modified the chart. But Voss was right about one thing. He was too young to be the architect. He'd been given a framework and handed tools and taught what to do with them by people who'd been doing it long before he arrived. That didn't excuse him, but it located him accurately. She went to check on Merritt. I was sitting up fully now, the supplemental oxygen removed, which told her Ehrlich had completed a reassessment and liked what he found. I was on the phone when she entered and held up a finger, 1 minute, and finished the call in 3 sentences that she didn't try to parse. When he lowered the phone, his face had the particular arrangement of someone who has been receiving a rapid series of updates and is integrating them in real time. Sayers tells me you have the audit trail, he said. Records department generated it this morning, before anyone realized what it would show. And the drive? Voss has it, or will have it. She sat in the chair. The person they sent to pull it, I don't have his name. He's not clinical staff. Facilities management, Merritt said. His name is probably Greg Ohlert. He's been running infrastructure support for the administrative wing for 3 years. His personnel file is going to show a background in commercial IT, which is accurate but incomplete. He paused. His previous employer before the commercial work was a private logistics firm that we've been looking at for 2 years in connection with supply chain irregularities related to a federal contract. The firm has a medical component. Lakemont is one of their client institutions. She absorbed this. The hospital is a node. Not the only one, but a useful one. Remote location, regional authority, a charge infrastructure that had been cultivated over several years to be responsive to certain requests. He looked at his hands, which were resting on the blanket with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. Holt was recruited 8 years ago, not coercively. She was approached, she made a decision, she's been compensated for it. Pallister was identified during residency and mentored into the position. Forsyth has been the administrative umbrella. He provided institutional cover and access. Ohlert managed the technical side. He paused. It's a small network, but small networks that are embedded deeply enough can do significant damage over a significant period of time. What kind of damage? Claire said. He looked at her for a moment. Specific patients being routed to specific physicians. Certain clinical outcomes being documented differently than they occurred. Staff who noticed things being managed out of their positions. He held her gaze. You were supposed to leave, Claire. When Holt started documenting the friction complaints 2 years ago, the expectation was that it would push you to resign. You didn't. I don't resign from things. I know. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. That was inconvenient for them. She looked at the mountains through the window for a moment. Then, how does Kandahar connect to this? The transport that was interdicted last night was carrying documentation related to the federal contract investigation. I was the custodial officer for the package. Someone with access to federal transport routing leaked the schedule, and whoever I was carrying the documentation for knew the window. He exhaled slowly. The person who leaked that schedule is in this building. Not Forsyth. He doesn't have that kind of access. Not Holt. Someone else. Someone we haven't identified yet. She went still. You're telling me there's a 4th person? At least. Someone in the building. In the building, or with sustained access to the building's communications infrastructure, which, given what we now know about the ghost account and the monitoring setup, he left the sentence where it was. He didn't need to finish it. She thought about the 9 minutes. Forsyth's call in the corridor to whoever was on the other end. Alert dispatched to the server room. 9 minutes was fast. Almost too fast for a spontaneous decision. Almost like a contingency plan that had already been prepared waiting for the trigger. The ghost account, she said. 14 months. Diane's credential. Who administered the access permissions that allowed it to stay active after she left. Merritt's expression sharpened. IT security. IT security reported to facilities. Facilities reports to the COO. Marsh, he said. Marsh made notes in the board meeting this morning. She said almost nothing. She let Forsyth run the room. Claire thought about the uncapped pen. The ledger balance precision. She's been in the administrative structure of this hospital for 12 years. She would have been here when Holt was recruited. Merritt reached for his phone. I need to make a call. Voss is working a sequenced approach. She doesn't want a tip. I'm not calling Voss. He was already dialing. I'm calling someone who needs to know that the scope just changed. She stood up. Don't go far, he said, phone to his ear. She went as far as the corridor, which was far enough. The next 40 minutes were the specific kind of controlled chaos that looked, from the outside, like nothing much was happening. Federal process had that quality. The visible surface calm, concealing the rapid mechanical work happening just below it. Voss's team worked the lower level. The marshals held the fourth floor. Hospital security, most of whom had no clear picture of what was occurring or whose authority was currently operative, defaulted to staying visible and doing nothing consequential, which was the most useful thing they could have done. Claire spent most of it at the nursing station with Ehrlich, who had decided she was an ally and was sharing information with the straightforward practicality of a man who had realized that the institutional allegiances he'd been operating within were less stable than he'd believed. 3 staff members in the past 4 years, he said quietly. I know of 3 personally who were pushed out after raising documentation concerns. One of them was a senior nurse who caught a pattern in the way certain post-operative patients were being coded, billing codes that didn't match the actual procedures. She filed an internal complaint. 6 weeks later, she was terminated for a performance issue that nobody had documented before. I thought it was... He paused. I thought it was the way things worked. That she'd become difficult and the institution had responded. I didn't ask the right questions. Most people don't, Claire said. Not as absolution, just as fact. You did. I asked the wrong questions for 6 years and then accidentally asked the right one. She looked down the corridor. That's not a methodology I'd recommend. At 3:17, Voss came up from the lower level with an expression that said she had what she needed and was now moving to the next phase. She conferred briefly with the marshals, then came to where Claire and Ehrlich were standing. We're moving on Forsyth, she said, and we're moving on Marsh concurrently. I'd like you present for Forsyth's, not in the room, in the building. There may be things he says that require clinical contextualization that my team doesn't have. I'll be here, Claire said. Voss nodded and moved toward the administration stairwell. Claire watched her go. Then she looked at Ehrlich. Who's covering the ER right now? He checked his watch. Day attending, Kowalski. A pause. Holt's still down there. She thought about Marissa, running her floor with the same precise efficiency she'd applied to everything else, including the phone calls she'd made after the board meeting, including the 2 access events on a patient chart at 4 a.m., including whatever she'd added to the incident report at 5:45. Running the floor, managing her staff, performing the function of a competent charge nurse, as she had done for 11 years, some portion of which had been in service of something that had cost people she'd worked beside their careers, and possibly more. Voss said not yet, Claire said. I know, Ehrlich said. He didn't sound satisfied about it either. They waited. At 3:41, Gerald Forsyth was escorted from his third-floor office to a conference room, not the carpeted one where the review board had met, but a smaller room adjacent to it that Voss's team had commandeered, by 2 federal agents who did not raise their voices and did not rush him and did not, by any visible measure, give him any indication of whether the next hour would be recoverable. Claire was at the nursing station on 4 when her phone buzzed. Harlan. Forsyth is cooperating, partially. He's giving up Olert and the logistics connection. He's not giving up the transport leak. She read it. Then, because he doesn't know who it is or because he's protecting them? The response took 2 minutes. Unknown. Voss thinks he genuinely may not know the identity. The transport leak was handled through a separate channel that Forsyth had access to the output of, but not the source. He knew the schedule was being passed. He didn't know who was passing it. She put the phone down, picked it back up. What about Marsh? A longer pause this time. Long enough that she checked the signal on her phone. Marsh isn't in her office. She left the building at 3:04. Security has her on camera at the parking structure. They've flagged her vehicle, but she was already standing. But what? She typed. Her car is still in the lot. She didn't drive out. She walked into the structure and didn't come out the other side. The parking structure connected to the hospital by an enclosed walkway on the second floor. The walkway was primarily used by staff parking in the structure, a covered route that kept people out of the Montana weather. It also connected at its midpoint to an external stairwell that came down to the service road behind the facility. A service road that was not monitored by the parking structure cameras. She was moving before she finished the thought, past Harlan, past the marshals, through the double doors, taking the elevator this time because the stairs deposited her on the wrong floor for the walkway entrance. Second floor, east wing. She pushed through the corridor doors and into the covered walkway, which was a long glass and steel passage that ran between the main building and the structure, ambient light coming through the panels, the sound of the wind against the glass audible, but muffled. She was halfway across when she saw her. Delia Marsh was at the far end of the walkway, not moving, standing with the stillness of someone who had been walking and stopped and was now recalculating. She was in her coat, the practical dark wool coat of someone who had already decided they were leaving. She had a bag on her shoulder, not her usual briefcase. A go bag, not an office bag. She saw Claire at the same moment Claire saw her. For a second, neither of them moved. The walkway was empty except for the two of them, the glass panels filtering the afternoon light into something flat and even, the mountains visible through the far panels in the specific way that Montana mountains were always visible, the background to everything. Then Marsh turned and pushed through the walkway door toward the structure. Claire ran. Not sprinting. The walkway had a slight grade and the flooring was composite and her shoes were not built for it, but running, the kind of running that covered ground efficiently. She hit the door Marsh had gone through and came into the parking structure's second level, concrete and low ceilings, and the smell of exhaust and cold, and stopped. Marsh was at the stairwell door 20 feet away. She had her hand on the push bar. She looked back at Claire. "Stop," Claire said. Flat, not loud. The word that meant she wasn't asking. Marsh looked at her. Her face was not what Claire expected, not the ledger-balanced neutrality of the conference room. Something much more tired. The face of someone who had been carrying a specific weight for a long time and was now in the moment just after putting it down, unsure whether the absence of it was relief or loss. "You're not security," Marsh said. "No. You're suspended." "Yes." A beat. Marsh's hand stayed on the push bar. "I have nothing to say to you." "I know." Claire took 3 slow steps forward. "You don't have to say anything to me, but you're about to walk through that door and down to the service road and wherever you're going from there, and the people who are still in that building are going to be looking for you in about 4 minutes. And the car you were going to take is still in the lot because you left without it." She paused. "Where were you going, Delia?" Marsh's jaw shifted slightly. 12 years? Claire said. "You've been in this building 12 years. You know what Holt was doing. You know what the patient routing looked like. You know about the staff who were pushed out." She stopped 6 feet away. "You kept records." Something moved in Marsh's face. "Patricia isn't the only one who's been documenting anomalies," Claire said. "Patricia reported upward and was told it was a system artifact. You're the one she reported to, which means you either buried it or you kept it." She watched her. "You're not the architect. Forsyth built this. But you've been in the room for 12 years, which means you know things that Forsyth doesn't know you know." Marsh looked at the push bar under her hand. She looked at the concrete wall. She looked briefly at nothing. "The transport leak," Claire said quietly. "You know who it is." The silence lasted 8 seconds. She counted them. Then Marsh let go of the push bar. She turned around. She set her bag on the concrete floor of the parking structure and looked at Claire with the expression of someone who has made a decision that was probably several years overdue and is not sure whether to call it courage or exhaustion. There's a name, she said. I've had it for 6 months. I didn't know what to do with it because the person it belongs to is someone nobody would look at. Claire held very still. It's not a physician, Marsh said. It's not administration. It's not technical staff. She looked at Claire with something that might have been the beginning of an explanation that would take longer than a parking structure deserved. It's someone who's been in this building longer than I have. Someone who has access to clinical scheduling, transport coordination, and federal patient intake records. A pause. Someone who has been coordinating with the logistics network through an access point that nobody thought to look at because nobody thought to look at them. Claire's mind was running the list of people she knew in this building. 6 years of faces, of shift patterns, of the invisible architecture of who was where and when, longer than Marsh, access to scheduling, transport, intake. Her phone buzzed. She didn't look at it. Tell me the name, she said. Marsh told her, and Claire stood in the cold concrete quiet of the parking structure and felt the specific sensation of a puzzle piece dropping into a space that had been visibly empty for so long she'd stopped registering it as absence. The shape of something that had been hiding not in shadow, but in plain sight, in a role so familiar it had become invisible, in a building full of people who saw this person every single day and never once thought to ask the right question. She looked at her phone. The message was from Bev. Claire, I need you to know something. I've been sitting on this because I wasn't sure it mattered. But the night of the incident, around midnight before the ambulance came in, I saw someone on the phone in the ambulance bay, standing outside. Couldn't hear the call. I didn't think anything of it at the time. A pause in the message, the natural pause of someone choosing words. It was Lorraine Pruitt, 58 years old, 26 years at Lakemont General. Patient intake and transport coordination. The woman who processed every ambulance arrival, every interfacility transfer request, every federal patient intake form that came through the facility. The woman who had handed off Dale Merritt's intake paperwork the night he arrived, who had been standing at the far end of the ambulance bay when the paramedics pushed through the doors, who was so thoroughly a fixture of this building that Claire had walked past her 2,000 times without once. She called Voss. One ring. Donovan, Voss answered. Lorraine Pruitt, Claire said, patient intake and transport, 26 years on the job. She made a phone call from the ambulance bay before Merritt came in. She paused. She's your transport leak. A very brief silence. Where are you? Parking structure, second level. I'm with Delia Marsh, who came here with a name and changed her mind about leaving. She looked at Marsh, who was standing with her bag at her feet and her arms folded against the cold. Marsh has 6 months of documentation on the logistics connection that she's been sitting on. She'll talk. Another brief silence. Then, don't let either of you move. We're not going anywhere, Claire said. She lowered the phone. Marsh was looking at her with the specific expression of someone who has passed a point of no return and is now simply waiting for the landscape on the other side to become clear. Not relief. Not resolution. The in-between state of something that had been held a long time, released. 26 years, Marsh said quietly. She's been here 26 years. I know, Claire said. Nobody looks at the person who's been there the longest. No, Claire said. They don't. The parking structure was cold and quiet around them, the mountains still visible through the open sides of the upper level, the afternoon light going flat with the particular indifference of late afternoon in a valley. Below them somewhere, the hospital was continuing its work, monitors and medications, and shift changes, and the reliable, ongoing project of keeping people alive. And inside it, a woman who had been standing at the intake desk for 26 years was still there, still processing arrivals, still performing the function of someone whose job was to know exactly who was coming and when. Claire's phone buzzed again. Not Voss. The routed number. Pruitt is at the intake desk, she doesn't know yet. Voss is coordinating approach. There's one more thing, the documentation Marsh has. If it includes what we think it includes, we can tie the logistics network to 2 other facilities in Montana and 1 in Idaho. This is larger than Lakemont. A pause. You understand what that means? She looked at Marsh. How much do you have? Claire said. Marsh reached into the bag at her feet and unzipped it and showed her what was inside. It was not a go bag. It was a document bag, organized, tabbed, the careful accumulation of someone who had been building a record for reasons they hadn't fully committed to yet, keeping it because they weren't ready to use it and weren't ready to destroy it either. A person in the middle place, waiting for something to tip them in a direction. 6 months, Marsh said. Every anomaly I could access and document without triggering the monitoring, printed, not digital. She looked at the bag with something that might have been a complicated pride. I knew they had the system watched. I couldn't risk the digital trail. Claire looked at the bag. That's enough, she said quietly. Is it? Marsh's voice was not quite steady. More than enough. She held her gaze. It's enough to end this. All of it. Not just here. The stairwell door opened behind her. 2 of Voss's colleagues came through, badges visible, moving with the calm efficiency of people who had been told exactly where to go. They looked at Marsh. They looked at Claire. They looked at the bag. Ms. Marsh, one of them said, if you're ready. Marsh picked up the bag. She looked at Claire for a moment, a long, complicated look that contained things there wasn't time or language for in a parking structure on a Tuesday afternoon, and then she walked toward them. Claire watched her go. Her phone buzzed. Voss again. We have Pruitt. Intake desk. She didn't resist. A pause. She asked if you were the one who put it together. Claire read the message twice. She typed, What did you tell her? The response was immediate. I told her a nurse caught it. She stood in the cold and looked at the mountains through the open side of the structure and thought about Lorraine Pruitt at her intake desk for 26 years, processing arrivals, coordinating transports, knowing exactly who was coming and when. And she thought about how a building could hold something like that. A rot at its intake point, its first point of contact, for so long without it being visible, because the person had been there long enough to become part of the architecture. She thought about Dale Merritt's eyes in the trauma bay, the specific quality of recognition in them. Her phone buzzed one more time, a number she didn't recognize, local prefix. She answered. Silence on the line for a moment. Then a voice she recognized immediately, even through the connection, even through the exhaustion that was threaded through it. A voice that had spent the past 20 hours doing the work of staying alive. They told me it was you, Merritt said. All of it. She said nothing. Claire. His voice was quiet. Not weak, just stripped down to the thing it needed to say. I need to tell you something I should have found a way to say 11 years ago. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. The mountains were still there. There's a debrief tomorrow, she said. You can tell me then. There's a debrief tomorrow, he agreed, but this isn't for the debrief. A pause. What you did out there, both times, I know you didn't do it for recognition. I know you don't need to hear it, but I need to say it, so I'm going to say it. His voice was steady in the way voices are steady when someone has decided to spend the steadiness on something that matters. You are the best soldier I have ever seen, in or out of uniform. She stood in the parking structure with the cold coming in off the mountains and her phone against her ear and said nothing for a moment. I'm a nurse, she said. Yeah, he said. I know. She looked at the bag Marsh had carried. She looked at the stairwell where Voss's colleagues had walked through with a woman who had spent 6 months building a record she didn't know how to use. She looked at the afternoon light going flat and the mountains going blue in it. Get some rest, she said. You still need it. She hung up. And somewhere on the intake level of Lakemont General, in the quiet, controlled aftermath of a federal action that had begun with an ambulance and a needle and a woman standing in a corner holding a clipboard, the last piece of a network. 26 years in the building was sitting in a room, answering questions, while the building around it began the slow, necessary work of becoming something it had failed to be for a very long time. The debrief was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following Thursday, in a federal building in Helena that looked like every federal building in every mid-sized state capital, the kind of architecture that communicated permanence without inspiration, the government's way of saying, we were here before you and we'll be here after. Claire drove herself. 2 hours and 40 minutes on I-90 with the mountains doing what Montana mountains did in the early morning, which was exist at a scale that made most human problems seem correctly sized. She had slept, actually slept, for the first time in what felt like a month, though it had only been 8 days since the night Dale Merritt had been wheeled through the ambulance bay doors. She had slept in her own apartment in her own bed and woken up at 6 without an alarm, which was how her body worked when it wasn't being asked to override itself. 8 days. In 8 days, the following had occurred, not in this order and not cleanly, because nothing in institutional collapse occurred cleanly, regardless of what the official timelines would later suggest. Gerald Forsyth had been placed on administrative leave within 3 hours of Voss's initial interview and formally arrested on the 5th day, charged with obstruction of federal investigation, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, and 2 counts of tampering with medical records. His attorney, the one in Billings who had taken the call, entered an appearance and immediately began negotiating, which told everyone who understood these things that Forsyth had things he was willing to trade. The negotiation was ongoing. Delia Marsh had spent 4 hours with Voss's team on the day of her near departure from the parking structure and had produced the document bag in its entirety. 47 tabbed sections covering 6 months of anomaly records, including billing irregularities, patient routing patterns, and correspondence she had accessed through her COO privileges and printed without flagging her own access. She was cooperating fully. Her attorney had filed paperwork indicating her intention to provide complete cooperation in exchange for consideration, and Voss had indicated, in the careful language of federal investigators who did not make promises, that her early and comprehensive cooperation would be noted in all appropriate places. What that meant in practice was still being determined, but Marsh had made her choice and was living with it, which was more than could be said for the people who had made different ones. Marissa Holt had been arrested on day 3. The timing had been Voss's, waiting for the access logs from Patricia's audit trail to be formally entered into the federal evidence record before moving, ensuring that the chain of custody was airtight. Holt had not cooperated. Her attorney had issued a statement through the press that used words like overreach and mischaracterization and dedicated healthcare professional, and the statement had landed in the local news with the precise resonance of a stone dropped into a lake, the initial splash, and then the ripples that showed everyone watching exactly where the stone had gone in. She had lost her nursing license within 48 hours of arrest on an emergency suspension order from the state board, pending the criminal proceedings. The charges were federal healthcare fraud, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy. The records Patricia had preserved, the access logs Bev had pulled, and the certified audit trail Claire had carried out of the record suite in an envelope had made the evidentiary picture specific enough that her attorney's public statements were doing work that the facts were not going to support. Marcus Pallister had been terminated from his residency position on day 2, which had happened through the hospital's medical credentialing committee rather than through federal action. The committee, having reviewed the audit evidence and the nursing board complaint, and reached conclusions that didn't require federal prompting. He was facing proceedings before both the state medical licensing board and a federal grand jury on the records falsification charge. He was 29 years old and had walked into an already corrupted framework and made the choice to use it, and whatever mitigation existed in the former did not erase the latter. His career in emergency medicine was over before it had properly started. Claire did not feel satisfaction about this. She felt the specific, unglamorous weight of watching a waste happen, talent bent wrong, potential spent on something that left nothing standing. Lorraine Pruitt had said almost nothing in her initial federal interview beyond confirming her name and requesting an attorney. The attorney had arrived, and the interviews had resumed, and they were still ongoing. What was known from the documentation Marsh had provided and from the federal logistics investigation that had been running parallel to the Lakemont action was that Pruitt had been passing transport routing information, not just Merritt's, at least 2 prior transports over 18 months, through a contact in the private logistics firm that Ohlert was connected to. The shape of why she had done it was still being established. 26 years in a building, and somewhere in those 26 years something had shifted. A debt, a threat, a payment. Something that had moved her from intake coordinator to a functional component of a network. She probably hadn't fully understood when she entered it. Understanding why people made the choices they made did not change the choices. But Claire had spent enough time in the space between easy answers and true ones to know that the true ones mattered, even when they didn't excuse anything. Greg Ohlert had given up the logistics network within 6 hours of his initial interview. He was, Voss had told Claire in one of the brief updates she provided, more frightened than committed. A man who had understood himself to be a technician in a system and had not fully gamed out what the system was part of. His cooperation had expanded the scope of the investigation to 2 other hospitals in Montana and 1 in Idaho, all of them connected to the same private logistics firm, through the same model: embedded access, cultivated administrative relationships, patient routing, and documentation manipulation for purposes that were still being fully mapped. It was larger than Lakemont. It was larger than Ashford. It was the kind of thing that, when the full picture eventually became public, would produce exactly the response that the full pictures of these things always produced: the disbelief, the how did nobody see it, the careful retrospective audit of every moment when someone almost looked directly at it and didn't. The answer to how did nobody see it was always the same answer, in Claire's experience. People saw it. They saw pieces of it, edges of it, the shadows it cast. They reported upward and were told it was a system artifact. They wrote things down in sealed envelopes and waited for someone to ask the right question. They worked beside it for 23 years and documented anomalies in a file they kept because they weren't ready to use it and weren't ready to destroy it. They decided it wasn't worth the fight. Sometimes a needle went in and the air rushed out and the calculus changed. The federal building in Helena had a parking garage beneath it that required a visitor pass from the main entrance. Claire got her pass, parked on level 2, and took the elevator to the 4th floor, where a woman at a desk confirmed her name and offered her coffee, which she accepted, and pointed her toward a conference room at the end of a carpeted hall that was somewhat more pleasant than Lakemont's carpeted hall, though the underlying smell of institutional function was the same. Merritt was already there. He was standing at the window, a different window than the one at Lakemont, looking at a different mountain range, but the posture was the same. The posture of someone who had spent a significant portion of their life in rooms where decisions were made and had learned to take the window when it was available. He turned when she entered. He was in civilian clothes again, and the gray at his temples was more visible in the morning light than it had been in the low illumination of a hospital room, and the way he was holding his left side told her the wound was healing but not healed, the body doing its work at the body's pace without consulting anyone's schedule. He looked better than a man who'd lost that much blood had any right to look a week later. She noted this with the clinical part of her brain and filed it. "You drove," he said. "I like driving." 2 hours and 40 minutes. 2 hours and 38. She put her coffee on the conference table. "How's the chest?" "Functional." He said it the way soldiers said things were functional, meaning it hurt and was not worth discussing. "Ehrlich wants a follow-up next week. I told him I'd be in Ashford." She looked at him. "You're coming back?" "I have testimony to give, and—" He paused in the way that meant the next thing was not administrative. "I want to be present for the board hearing." She knew which board hearing he meant. Not the hospital's internal review that had already been resolved. The suspension lifted on day 4 with a written institutional apology that was formal and careful and contained the word regret 4 times, which was either very regretful or not at all, depending on how you read institutional language. The nursing board. The state proceedings that Pallister's complaint had triggered, which had to run their own course on their own timeline, regardless of the federal action, because regulatory bodies operated in parallel to criminal processes and answered to different mandates. The hearing was in 11 days. "You don't have to be there," she said. "I want to be." Merritt. "I have something to say to that board," he said simply, "and I'm going to say it." He looked at her with the particular steadiness of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in being redirected. "You showed up for me twice. I show up once. That's not even close to even, but it's what I can do right now." She looked at the table, at her coffee, at the window where the mountains were doing what they did. "Okay," she said. The door opened and Voss came in, followed by 2 of her colleagues and a man Claire hadn't seen before, older, Justice Department rather than HHS. The particular gravity of someone whose involvement meant the action had moved up a level. He introduced himself, shook hands, sat down. The debrief began. It lasted 4 hours. Claire gave her account 3 times, once in narrative, once in response to specific questions, once with particular focus on the medical sequence of events in Bay 3. She was precise, and she was comprehensive, and when she didn't know something, she said she didn't know it, which Voss noted with the expression of someone accustomed to witnesses who filled gaps with inference and appreciated the absence of it. Merritt gave his account concurrently in a separate room. She learned this after, that they'd run the sessions parallel to prevent coordination, which was standard and which neither of them would have needed explained. The Justice Department official asked her, at the end of the 3rd session, whether she intended to remain at Lakemont General. She thought about this for a moment. genuinely thought about it, not performing deliberation, actually running the question. "Ask me in a month," she said. He nodded as if this were a complete answer. Maybe it was. What? The public accounting came in stages over the following 2 weeks, the way these things always came. Not in a single revelation, but in a series of smaller ones, each landing with its own weight. The cumulative picture assembling in the public record, the way a case assembled in a legal record, piece by piece, each piece specific, the whole greater than the parts. The state nursing board issued an emergency notice regarding Marissa Holt's license suspension, which was public record. The local paper in Ashford picked it up. Then a reporter in Helena noticed the federal action filing and connected it to the Lakemont name and ran a piece that was careful and sourced and said, without sensationalizing, that federal investigators had identified a pattern of medical record falsification and patient routing irregularities at a regional hospital connected to a private logistics firm under federal investigation. The piece mentioned a nurse whose intervention had saved a patient's life and who had subsequently been suspended and had her records challenged. It did not name Claire. It did not need to. Within 2 days, the story had been picked up regionally. Within 4 days, it had been picked up nationally. Not as a major story, not the kind that dominated cycles, but the kind that found its audience in the people who paid attention to healthcare systems and institutional accountability and the specific grinding question of who got believed in rooms full of people with credentials and authority. The hospital's board of directors convened an emergency session on day 9 and issued a public statement that was 12 paragraphs long and acknowledged, in language that had been reviewed by outside counsel, that systemic failures in administrative oversight had allowed irregularities to persist over a period of years, that those responsible were being held accountable through appropriate legal and regulatory channels, and that the institution was committed to a comprehensive reform of its clinical governance structure. The statement mentioned, in the 10th paragraph, that the staff member whose actions had exposed these failures had been fully reinstated with back pay and an institutional apology. It did not say her name. Her name was already in the regional paper. It was in the national pickup. It was in the record. Gerald Forsyth resigned from his position on day 10, pursuant to a separation agreement that his attorney and the hospital board's attorney had been negotiating since day 5. The resignation was announced in a single sentence attached to the board's reform statement. The criminal proceedings continued regardless, because institutional separation agreements did not touch federal charges. The hospital announced, on the same day, that it was conducting a comprehensive audit of every patient record flagged in the federal investigation's preliminary findings, and that any patient whose records had been altered or whose care had been affected by the documented irregularities would be notified and offered support. The audit was expected to take several months. Several months, Claire knew, meant that the full accounting was going to be longer and uglier and more specific than anything the 12-paragraph statement had suggested, and that the people who had trusted Lakemont General with their care over the past 8 years were going to spend several months finding out what that trust had been worth in practice. This was the part that didn't resolve cleanly. This was the part that wouldn't. Some things didn't resolve cleanly. You still had to do them. The nursing board hearing was on a Wednesday. It was held in a state office building in Missoula, 2 hours from Ashford, in the other direction from Helena, in a room that was smaller than Claire had expected, with a paneled table and 7 board members and the particular formal atmosphere of a proceeding that was serious but not criminal, which meant it had its own weight and its own language and its own way of arriving at conclusions. Pallister's complaint had been formally reviewed. The board had, at that point, the certified audit trail from Patricia, the access logs from Bev's informatics contact, the time-stamped evidence of post hoc chart modification, the federal investigative findings that had been shared under a coordination agreement, and the testimony of 4 clinical staff members who had been present in Bay 3 on the night in question. They also had, submitted 10 days prior, a written statement from a special operations commander currently on medical leave addressing the clinical sequence of events, the nurse's intervention, and the outcome of that intervention with the specificity of a man who had been the patient. Claire sat at the respondent's table with her attorney, a woman named Barbara Holt, who was not related to Marissa, a coincidence that Barbara had noted on first introduction with the dry precision of someone who had been making this clarification for 2 weeks, and listened to the board's preliminary findings being read into the record. Merritt was in the room. He had flown back to Montana, as he'd said he would, and was sitting in the gallery with Harlan and another person Claire didn't recognize, in civilian clothes, looking like a man who was still healing and had decided this was worth the cost of a flight. When she had seen him in the hallway before the hearing convened, he had nodded at her, and she had nodded back, which was the appropriate amount of communication for two people who had said what needed to be said and were now here to let the record speak. The board took 45 minutes. At the end of 45 minutes, the chair, a woman in her 60s with the economical manner of someone who had spent a career making decisions about professional conduct and had long since shed the need to ornament them, summarized the board's findings. Pallister's complaint was dismissed in its entirety. The complaint was found to have been filed with the intent to mischaracterize a clinically appropriate emergency intervention, supported by evidence of post hoc record modification intended to alter the documented facts of the clinical sequence. The board found that Claire Donovan, RN, had acted within her legal scope of practice, in accordance with the applicable standard of care, and had performed a life-saving intervention in circumstances where the appropriate physician-initiated response had not been initiated. The board further found that her conduct on the night in question represented the standard toward which the profession aspired, not a deviation from it. The chair set down her summary sheet. "The complaint is dismissed," she said. "Ms. Donovan's record is clear. The board thanks her for her service to her patients." Barbara touched Claire's arm briefly. In the gallery, Merritt was looking at his hands. Claire sat in her chair and felt the particular quality of a thing settling. Not elation, not the clean triumph of a story that had resolved the way stories resolved when they were being shaped for an audience. Something smaller and more actual than that. The specific, unglamorous sensation of a weight being formally removed by people who had the authority to remove it, after it had been placed there by people who had done so deliberately and had known exactly what they were doing. She had not done any of this for this moment. She was clear about that. She had walked into Bay 3 because a man was 60 seconds from dead. She had gone to the 4th floor because she had needed to understand what she was part of. She had walked through a parking structure because a woman was about to leave with information that mattered. She had done each thing because the thing needed doing, without a clear vision of what came after. What came after was this room. A finding, a clear record, a chair setting down a piece of paper and saying the complaint was dismissed. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was in the specific accounting of what she had actually needed, exactly enough. She stood up, shook Barbara's hand, and walked out of the hearing room into the hallway, where the building's ventilation hummed and someone was having a conversation 30 feet away that had nothing to do with any of this. Merritt came out behind her a minute later. He stopped beside her. They stood in the hallway without talking for a moment. "Satisfied?" he said finally. She considered the word. "Ask me a different question. What do you want to do now?" She looked at the window at the end of the hallway. Missoula's mountains were different from Ashford's, lower on the eastern face, steeper to the west, the valley wider. Still the same geology, the same deep time compressed into visible strata, the same indifferent permanence. "Go home," she said. "I have a shift on Friday." He turned to look at her. "You're going back." "I'm a nurse." She looked at him. "I have patients." He didn't argue with this. He had spent too many years around people who understood the relationship between a function and an identity to argue with it. "The position Sayers discussed," he said. "The consulting role. Medical advisory for the Transport Security Protocol Review. It's still open." "I know." "You don't have to decide now." "I know that too." She picked up her bag from the chair she'd set it on. "I'll think about it. While I'm having a life." He almost smiled, the same almost smile as in the hospital room. Some expressions were consistent across a decade and a half and significant blood loss. "Fair." She started toward the exit. She stopped after 3 steps, turned back. "Kandahar," she said. "What you were going to tell me, before I said there was a debrief." He looked at her steadily. "I told you in the debrief. You told Voss and the Justice Department attorney and 2 federal investigators. That's not the same thing." She held his gaze. "Tell me." A pause. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "You held the compression for 22 minutes, he said. On a transport vehicle, in the dark, with incoming fire in the area. The extraction was late. The vehicle hit something, I don't know what, neither does the record. And you were thrown. You got up. You kept going. He paused. When the extraction team finally arrived, the medic who took over told me later that whoever had been holding it had to have been trained at a level above anything she'd seen in a field context. He stopped. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know your name. I just knew that someone had decided I was worth keeping alive and had made that decision at cost to themselves and had not stopped making it. Claire was quiet. 11 years ago, he said, and then last week. The same decision, the same person. He held her gaze with the directness of someone who had thought about what he wanted to say and was now simply saying it. I've been in this work a long time. I know what it looks like when someone does something because it's right and not because someone's watching. It looks like you. She did not have a clean answer to this. She was not built for clean answers to things like this. Had spent 11 years specifically avoiding the environments where someone might say them. So she stood in the hallway of a state office building in Missoula, Montana, and received the words without deflecting them, which was the most honest thing she could do. Get on your plane, she said finally. Let Ehrlich look at that chest. I have a follow-up Tuesday. Good. She turned and walked to the exit and pushed through the glass door into the afternoon air, which was cold and clean and full of the smell of pine and altitude and the specific clarity that came from being in a place where the sky was big enough to contain everything happening underneath it without appearing troubled by any of it. She was back in Ashford by 4:30. She did not go home first. She drove to the hospital, parked in the regular lot, not the physician lot, not this time, and went in through the main entrance and took the elevator to the 4th floor, not because she had a clinical reason to be there, but because she needed to be in the building before she was in it as a nurse again, to stand in it with the new knowledge of what it had been and make a decision about what she was willing to help it become. The double doors to 4 North opened with her badge. The corridor was quiet the way it had been on the night she'd first walked it. The monitors chimed their steady rhythms. A nurse she recognized from the overnight staff nodded at her from the station. Ehrlich was doing a chart review at the end of the corridor. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. Bored? He said. Dismissed. He nodded. Something in his posture changed, the held quality of a man who had been waiting for a specific piece of news and could now release it. Good. He looked at the chart, back at her. Bev's been asking about you. I'll talk to her. There's also been, the hospital is talking about reconstituting the clinical quality committee. Starting over. New charter, new membership. He said it carefully, the way you said things you wanted to be heard as an observation rather than a pitch. It's going to need people who understand what went wrong and why. She looked at the corridor. At the door of 4 North, which was open, the room empty now, Merritt discharged, the protective designation lifted, the room returned to the ordinary rotation of a post-operative floor. She thought about what a clinical quality committee could do in a building that had spent 8 years without one that functioned honestly. She thought about the audit that was going to take months and produce findings that were going to be uncomfortable and specific. She thought about the 3 staff members Ehrlich had named, the ones who had been pushed out for noticing the wrong things, and what it would mean to build something that gave people a place to bring what they noticed. I'm not a committee person, she said. I know. I'm a nurse. I know that too. He looked at her. But you're a nurse who spent 11 years training to be something more specific than that. And we have a building full of clinicians who are going to need someone to show them how to trust a system that has not been worthy of trust. He held her gaze. You don't have to do it, but I think you know how. She looked at the empty room. She thought about what Merritt had said. The best soldier I have ever seen. She had received the words and she had not deflected them. And in the 2 weeks since he had said them, she had been doing the quiet internal work of figuring out what to do with them. Not the recognition itself, which she did not need, but the function the recognition pointed toward. The thing the words named. She had spent 11 years reducing herself, making herself small enough to fit inside the background of a building that had, it turned out, been run by people for whom her smallness was useful. And the moment she had stopped being small, the moment she had walked through a curtain and put a needle in and refused to be background, the entire structure of the building had shifted. Not because she was exceptional, because she had done what the situation required, because someone had needed help, and she had been the person in the room who could provide it, and she had made the choice to be that person instead of the person who stood in the corner and held the clipboard. That choice was available to every person in a room at any given moment. The difference was in what you'd been trained to see, what you'd been taught to trust, and whether the institution you stood inside made room for someone to act on what they knew. This institution had not. It could. "I'll think about the committee," she said. Ehrlich's expression did not perform relief or victory. He was not that kind of person. He just nodded, which was the correct response, and went back to his chart. She walked back down the corridor. 3 weeks after the nursing board hearing, Patricia retired. She told almost no one before she did it. She submitted the paperwork on a Tuesday, worked through the end of her notice period, and on her last day she came in at 8, completed the records integrity audit she'd been running since the federal investigators had requested it, printed the final report, and placed it in the proper file. She gathered the few things she kept at her desk: the beaded glasses chain, 2 books, a small plant she had been keeping alive in her office for 11 years, which was not nothing, and she walked out. Claire found out from one of the records department staff who mentioned it in passing. She went down to the lower level that afternoon, which was quiet, and stood at Patricia's empty desk for a moment. The coffee cup was gone. The form she'd been filling out on the morning of the incident had been filed somewhere, completed, presumably, because Patricia completed things. The desk was clean and organized in the way of a person who had left because they chose to, not because something was unfinished. On the desk was a single index card, typed, centered, precise. The way Patricia did things. It said, 23 years. Someone finally asked the right question. Claire picked it up, read it twice, set it back down. She stood in the empty office for a moment. Outside the hospital, Ashford was doing what Ashford did, going about its Tuesday with the mountain-cupped calm of a valley that had been there long before the hospital and would be there long after. Somewhere above her, on the clinical floors, patients were being helped by people who were trying to do right by them, inside a system that was in the slow, imperfect, necessary process of becoming something it had failed to be for too long. It would not be smooth. There would be complications and resistances and new problems that the reform process hadn't anticipated, and old problems that the audit would surface that nobody was ready for. The other hospitals, the ones in the federal investigation's expanded scope, were going to go through versions of this same reckoning, and some of them would do it better, and some of them would do it badly, and all of it would take longer than anyone hoped. Lorraine Pruitt's legal process was going to run for 18 months. Forsyth's was going to run longer. Holt's attorney was already filing procedural motions that were going to extend the timeline. The work of accountability was slow and grinding and had none of the satisfying pace of the moment when everything broke open. But it was moving. It was moving because it had started. And it had started because a man had needed 60 seconds of work from the only person in the room who could provide it. Claire put Patricia's index card in her pocket. She went back upstairs. On her first Friday back on shift, the first ambulance came in at 7:12 a.m. A stroke, 63-year-old male, NIHSS of 14, the door to CT window critical. She was in the bay before the gurney was fully positioned, running the assessment, calling the numbers, doing the thing that the moment required because the moment required it, and she was there. The day attending was new, a woman named Dr. Keisha Farrow, who had transferred in from a hospital in Colorado, one of 3 new clinical hires the hospital had made as part of the restructuring. She was 40, competent, and had the specific quality of a physician who had worked beside good nurses long enough to know what that looked like. She watched Claire's initial assessment for approximately 30 seconds, then started working alongside it instead of over it, which was not nothing. Bev was on the shift. She caught Claire's eye across the bay at one point, just briefly, the glance that people exchange when they have been through something together that changed the coordinates of the relationship, and then went back to her patient, because there was a patient, and there was always a patient. At the end of the shift, which ran 40 minutes over because the stroke patient had developed a secondary complication that required additional stabilization, Claire sat in the break room for 11 minutes and ate a granola bar she'd been carrying in her locker since Tuesday and looked at the wall. She was tired in the way you were tired after a good shift, the bone-deep fatigue that felt different from the fatigue of dread or the fatigue of suppressed anger, which were the fatigues she'd been accumulating for 6 years without fully naming them. This was the fatigue of having done the work. It felt, improbably, like a form of rest. Her phone had 3 messages she hadn't checked during the shift. One from Barbara, informing her that Pallister's nursing board filing had been formally expunged from her record per board order, the final step in the clearing of her professional documentation. One from Sayers, 3 sentences. Consulting role is yours if you want it. No pressure, you've earned whatever you decide. And one from a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be from one of the nurses from the 3 to 11 shift, a woman named Andrea who had been at Lakemont for 2 years and had sent a message that said simply, "I heard what you did. I've been afraid to report some things I've seen. Can we talk?" Claire read Andrea's message twice. She typed back, "Yes, tell me when you're free." She put the phone in her pocket. She stood up, threw away the granola bar wrapper, and stood at the break room window. The parking lot was lit with the low amber of the security lights. The mountains invisible in the dark, but present in the way that things were present when you lived close enough to them to feel their weight in the air. She thought about what it cost to keep quiet. She knew the number, had been paying it for 6 years, in small daily installments, the way debts accrued when you didn't look at the balance. She thought about the people who had been paying it longer, and the ones who would be asked to pay it if nobody showed them a different option. She thought about a needle going in, air rushing out, a monitor stabilizing. The truth didn't need applause, and it didn't need an audience, and it didn't need to be large or dramatic, or the kind of thing that got told in a 12-paragraph institutional statement. It needed someone willing to act on it, in a trauma bay, in a hallway, in a parking structure, in a break room message at the end of a long shift. It needed someone who had made the quiet decision to be that person, regardless of what the room expected or what the institution preferred or what the cost turned out to be. The people who had built something on the expectation of silence had lost everything they'd built. Not because someone had set out to take it from them, but because one person, in one moment, had looked at what the situation required and done that thing instead of the easier one. Claire picked up her jacket. She turned off the break room light. She walked back out onto the floor, where there were patients and work, and a building in the long, unfinished process of earning back what it had squandered. And she went back to the thing she had always been. Not a soldier, not a symbol, not the story that would eventually be told about this night and the nights around it. A nurse, doing the work. Because the work was there, and she was the person in the room. That had always been enough. It always would be.